Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Outside the window of the cozy hotel there was a terrible bad weather. It lasted for the fourth day, preventing the owner of the woodworking factory, Kelvin Henderson, to get to the enterprise, where a major deal should be concluded. He decided to take no chances and come in person. Last time this company slipped in partially substandard goods. The deal was at a loss. This time they promised top quality goods and a huge discount to smooth the edges and not lose the customer. Calvin flew out of the house just as the bad weather played out. The plane barely managed to land. It was a hard landing. For a man who was already afraid of flying, it was a nightmare. Calvin could not calm down for more than an hour afterwards, telling his wife about what he had experienced. Now the weather was keeping him out of the forested part of Alaska, where there was a warehouse with finished wood. All he had to do was assess the quality and check the number symbol so there would be no fraud. Then he was to put a couple of signatures and return home to his beloved Cassandra. Cassandra was indeed his favorite wife. They met, liked each other, and started dating. A year later, they signed at the registry office, and she took his surname. They had been married for 4 years and dreamed of having a baby. But it didn't work out. It didn't come out on its own. Neither of them had time to go for a checkup. They didn't seem to be in any hurry, but they wanted to. Calvin promised to take a holiday at the end of the year and go with Cassandra to one of the best clinics in the city for an examination. It was going to take a few days. Cassandra was also going to take time off work for this period. She was a successful interior designer. She was invited to the best houses, commissioned to design cafes and public buildings. That day, Calvin had a row with a bunch of transport companies. "I've been stuck here for 5 days. Guys, this isn't serious. You guys tell me every day you're going to take me there tomorrow. It's only 70 kilometers away. Yeah, I know it's bad weather. Well, let me hire a tractor or some heavy equipment that will definitely get there. You understand, I'm tired of sitting in 4 walls and waiting for a miracle. I need to get there." The dispatcher on the other end of the line only shrugged sadly, checking the disappointing weather forecast. "I'm sorry, we rarely have prolonged snowstorms. We do, or rather, but they usually subside and we can work. Right now, all the equipment is standing still. Even aviation won't take to flying out there in this weather." Calvin pressed his lips together and hung up the phone. He had heard that the blizzard had already reached his hometown. Winter was raging across the vastness of Alaska. He dialed his wife's number. "Cassandra, pick up the phone," he whispered over the dial tone, looking melancholically out the window. It was pitch black out there, and this was at 12. His wife hadn't answered her phone since morning. What's wrong? Such bad weather, and she must have gone to the customer's house again, Calvin thought. It was a blessing that their town didn't have such severe snowstorms. Public transport worked in all weathers. When Cassandra started working on a project, she could stay off the phone all day. If Calvin complained to her in the evening, she just shrugged. "Yeah, I didn't mute it. I was just so immersed in my work that I didn't notice the calls. I'm sorry. You know how passionate I get when I'm given an interesting creative assignment, especially if I don't have to stay within a tight budget." She was a beautiful tall blonde, always well-groomed, with manicures and a bunch of different handbags, each personalized to match a particular outfit. Calvin saw in her not only business acumen and the image of a businesswoman, which Cassandra skillfully maintained. He saw that she was a very kind person who would always come to the rescue, would not leave a stray kitten in the street, and would certainly help her grandmother cross the road. Even if the customer of the year would be waiting for her at that time, it happened, and Calvin never tired of marveling at how versatile his wife could be. Toward evening, the phone rang. It was his father calling. "Mr. Nicholas, hello, how are you?" Calvin smiled. His father-in-law rarely called. He'd always disliked Calvin a little, and the man didn't know how to establish a relationship with him. Still, they had become family, and it always upset him. If Dad started dismissively in Calvin's direction. "No way. Cassandra crashed today, funeral tomorrow. came over the phone. Calvin was speechless for a second. He slumped back in his chair. "What are you saying?" "Hold on." "No. Everything happened this morning. We're on our way out. We'll be ordering a memorial service from the funeral home. Already made arrangements. Tomorrow is the farewell. Can you make it?" Calvin couldn't believe it. "No, I won't be able to get anywhere from here. The planes haven't flown for days. Blizzard. Mr. Nicholas happened. I don't understand. I can't understand." He spoke confusedly. His ears were noisy and his head was spinning. "Driving home from work. The car ended up on the river. The ice hasn't frozen properly yet. The car went under. We can't wait for you to get here. Cassandra didn't wait for you, and neither will we. Didn't keep you safe. We didn't either." There was a beeping sound in the receiver. Calvin couldn't believe what had happened. How is this possible? His wife, his precious Cassandra, is dead. He called his mother. What if it's a stupid prank? What if he imagined it? She picked up the phone, and instead of the usual greetings, he heard the sobs of a mother who had lost her child. That's when he realized that it had really happened. His mother-in-law couldn't utter a sentence or two, only told him to come soon, and they couldn't put off the funeral, or their hearts would fail, or they'd go crazy with it all. Calvin sank down on the bed. Gotta cry now. Then he'd have to call dispatch. He gotta find a way to get to the funeral. Calvin remembered her face, her father-in-law and mother-in-law's words, but the tears wouldn't come. What's wrong? Isn't he sorry at all? Only his body felt terrible. He was about to pass out from the intense dizziness and tinnitus. Calvin sat up on the bed and dialed the airline's number. He rang all the private firms and was reserved and serious. My wife has died and I have to make it to the funeral. It's tomorrow. Please, any money. He was clearly answered. No. And Calvin realized that they couldn't. It was impossible to get a plane in the air in this weather. It would take too long to get there by car. He couldn't make it in time. Calvin called and without any emotion informed that he would not be able to attend the funeral. His mother had already calmed down and icily replied that she understood. It was just the way things were. Calvin switched off the earpiece and went to bed. He didn't feel well. He seemed to be shivering from the cold. He wrapped himself in the blankets, but it immediately made him too hot. And as soon as he opened up, he felt the chilling cold again. Near midnight, he drifted into sleep, but an hour later, he jumped up in a cold sweat. She's dead. The tears came only then, in the night, and he did not rest until the morning. It was only the maid's knock at the door that brought him to his senses. He chased her away, took a contrast shower, and decided he would try to get home as soon as possible. He sent an assistant to inspect the wood instead, and literally settled in at the airport himself. He could no longer be alone in the hotel and spent the next night there with the other people waiting for the flight. When Calvin arrived in his hometown, panic gripped him. What's next? How do I live now? The first thing he did was go to the cemetery. The parents said they couldn't wait and couldn't look at their daughter's face. They needed to bury her as soon as possible. Otherwise, the parents' hearts just couldn't take it. Calvin bought white roses, the ones she loved so much, and came to her grave. There was a ready-made monument with her picture, 2 dates, and the ubiquitous signature. We remember, we love, we mourn. Banal, so banal. He stared at her picture, tears dripping onto the snow. The blizzards had subsided, the sun was shining, and the cold winter sky overhead seemed bottomless. Hello, Uncle. Did you know Aunt Cassandra? Came from behind him. Calvin turned around and saw a girl in front of him. She looked to be about 6 years old, 2 blonde pigtails, an ordinary child, and holding a spatula. Yes, knew her. Did you know her too? Calvin squatted down to be closer to his little interlocutor. Of course I did. She wanted to take me away from Daddy. I live round the corner here, and she used to come round to visit and talk to Daddy. And he didn't mind giving me to her for good. She wanted to be my mom. I don't have one, and I should have one, except she's dead. saw the funeral yesterday. I ran up and there was an empty coffin in her picture. They told me they hadn't found her, but they still had to bury her. That's how it's supposed to be done. And I said, is Cassandra really dead? And they told me she was. So I cried and they just buried the coffin. Dad said I shouldn't be upset cause Cassandra can always see me from the sky now. She's the good one. And the bad ones, they can't see anything from up there. Calvin didn't know how to react to the child's reasoning. On the one hand, she was saying scary, creepy things. On the other hand, she was talking about it calmly. I wish adults could take things the same way. Was the coffin empty? Calvin asked suddenly, realizing what he had heard. Yes, I saw it myself. Went over to say goodbye. There was no one there. That's when I asked. Calvin decided to walk the little girl home. Firstly, he needed to understand why his wife wanted to adopt the child and hadn't said anything to him. Maybe the girl is confused about something. Maybe another Cassandra died. After all, they lived in a city of millions. Such a thing was theoretically possible. To make sense of it all, Calvin walked to Linda's house. That was the name of the little girl who had come to Cassandra's grave to shovel snow with the shovel. She was afraid she was cold. Hello, I'm Cassandra Henderson's husband. She came to see you. Linda's father met them with a bottle of beer in hand. The house smelled of alcohol. Beer was clearly not the only drink he had had today. Cassandra, is that the one who died yesterday? Yes, she came round. My condolences, brother. The slightly confused man patted Calvin on the shoulder. Are you talking about this woman? Calvin showed the landlord a picture of his wife. Yeah, she was at my house, wanting to pick up. I understand the girl needs her mother. I didn't mind. And now you see how? Calvin looked at the bottle in his hand. You don't hurt the girl. You've got her all over you. I'm not, honestly. But there's no one to take care of her. I work as a plumber. I don't belong to myself. And she's been alone in the house since she was 2 years old. Yes, I used to lock her in the playpen. Now I don't. She's old enough for a playpen. It's hard for the two of us, and we have no other relatives. Calvin listened to the story of Jack, Linda's father, and left. He couldn't think about continuing what he had started. He hadn't yet figured out how he would live without her, or if he would. Coming to the flat was the hardest part of the ordeal. Calvin was overcome with waves of crying. A neighbor, Grandma Mary, came in, patted him on the shoulder, told him not to hold it in. But after she left, the tears stopped. There was a kind of stupor. He touched Cassandra's things, adjusted the clothes on the rack. The makeup lay on the mirror, not yet knowing it would never be used again. Calvin dialed his mother-in-law's number. Why didn't you tell me the coffin was empty? He asked. A long sigh was heard on the other end of the line. How come they didn't tell me? They really didn't. I'm not myself. Calvin, I'm sorry. You need to talk to the coroner. The police were on the scene. She was pronounced dead. She couldn't get out of the car. Her body went under the ice. It happens all the time. In cases like this, they don't find her until spring. My father and I couldn't just wait all this time. But you said you couldn't see her dead. Wasn't that the case? Calvin began to hesitate. He wasn't thinking straight at the time, and neither were they, but something about the story disturbed him. And you, son, don't you feel any guilt? We lost a daughter. If you had worked less and been with her more often, we wouldn't be ordering black frames now. And you suspect us of something? There was an unnatural panic on the other end of the line. And that alarmed Calvin even more. There's something wrong with all this. Maybe they had a fight. Maybe they're the reason Cassandra ended up on that river. Calvin didn't bother asking anything else. He realized that no one would tell him anything. The hardest part of the next 3 weeks was not to snap. Calvin was torn between the inner and the outer. For him, the earth stopped turning. He grieved. Sat in a chair for hours, staring at one point, reveling in his grief. He cried when it became unbearable. He even smashed his hand against the wall. Yet he never left his daily cares for a day. It was like he was dead and still answering phones and going to business meetings. Calvin, the wood is rubbish. Wasted your time coming here in the first place. Cancel the deal, definitely. said his colleague Ashley, who had traveled to the cold northern city as soon as Kelvin had returned. He had never had time to visit the warehouse because of the tragic news. Calvin was answering something, consulting, signing papers. He came to the office reluctantly, promising himself that he would be back home in an hour, but at least the work distracted him somehow. For a few minutes he became himself again and didn't feel the heartbreaking emptiness inside. Eventually Calvin began to practically live at work. Sometimes he didn't even come home at night, because everything reminded him of her. On the fourth week, denial came. He rethought the whole thing once more. That girl in the cemetery, Linda. Yeah, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have even known the coffin was empty. Why wasn't he told? How could they leave out a detail like that? The wife's parents are obviously not telling the truth, and their reactions to questions. The mother-in-law cried at the drop of a hat, avoiding the uncomfortable subject. I won't believe it until I see her body with my own eyes, he grumbled to himself. Calvin dialed the number of a friend who had used the services of a private detective not so long ago to check his wife for marital fidelity. As a matter of fact, that friend was now going through a divorce. He quickly received reliable information with colorful illustrations. The wife would never confess, but when she saw the pictures, she didn't bicker. Calvin also decided to seek the services of a professional. The investigator's name was Carl. He was a middle-aged man and came to meet Calvin in a plain print t-shirt and sneakers. I never thought you were the best detective in our city, Calvin blurted out as they shook hands. Did you think I'd show up in a black trench coat and hat? The man laughed. Calvin outlined the detective in great detail. Having a lot of police experience under his belt, Carl said he could initially see the inconsistencies. Most likely, the case was really messy. He took it upon himself to investigate Cassandra's death, pulled a string, and facts came out that Calvin had no idea about. I was looking at the photos from the scene. It was like a blind man was looking at them. It was deliberately done to make the car go underwater. This should have been investigated. Instead, a report was written. It's all very negligent and careless, if not bizarre, but that's not all. I started digging into your wife's past to see if she had any enemies, and I found out some very interesting facts about her family. Between 93 and 96, Cassandra's parents, Mr. Nicholas and Mrs. Annie Wilson, worked for a very wealthy family. The Johnsons were the owners here. They had 2 daughters. Justin Johnson's was a criminal mastermind, made his fortune in racketeering. He had mental health issues. Old childhood trauma eventually took its toll. His wife almost divorced him, but rumor has it she was afraid to leave him. He was capable of anything. He was not to be messed with. Cassandra's parents worked for them for 3 years. Her father was in charge of the garden and the horses. Justin bred thoroughbreds. Your mother-in-law did all the housework. They even lived in separate rooms, but in the same house. Where are these Johnsons now? Why don't I know anything about them if they were so influential? Calvin asked. They burned down, replied Carl. There was a fire in the house. They say everyone died except Cassandra's parents and Justin himself. His face was badly burned. After the tragedy, he was committed to a mental institution. They say he never recovered. He was in hospice care at one time. There's no other information on him. He's probably still there. You didn't know anything about this? Cassandra didn't tell you? No. Yeah, she was just a toddler herself. She was born in 94, right? But her parents didn't tell her. Their association with a criminal mastermind, which the girl's family kept quiet about, and her mysterious death are 2 very strange coincidences. And I wouldn't believe even one. I'll keep digging. That's it for now. And I don't know how the Linda girl is involved in all this. Calvin also found it odd that he knew nothing about the story. So his wife had almost died when she was a baby. His parents had almost been burned too. They both claimed to have worked at the school all their lives. Maybe something shameful happened there. Something that shouldn't be remembered. But could it have anything to do with Cassandra's death? The thought made a lump come up to his throat. Calvin missed his wife terribly. All these thoughts kept him awake at night. He decided to help the detective in conduct so to speak, an unauthorized search of his parents' flat. Perhaps he could find out something from their past. Calvin knew where he kept the spare keys to his parents' flat. Knew also that they were both at school from 8 to 17. There was no problem. He just got there with the keys and walked in. None of the neighbors even saw him. And even if they had, they all knew he wasn't a stranger. If I get caught, I'll say I was looking for pictures or that I missed you a lot. Yeah, that's what I'll say, Calvin reasoned. The flat was clean and tidy as always. Calvin wandered modestly through the rooms. There was not even a whiff of morning. He quickly got settled in and looked in the fridge. A can of beer, as always, had been saved for his father-in-law for the evening. Fresh sausage and cakes had been bought. Mincemeat was defrosting downstairs. There was a note on the table. An appointment to see Marina for nails on Thursday at 5 p.m. It hardly looked like morning. And where are the black frames they talked about on the phone? There were no pictures around, just one picture of the wedding party on the wall. It had been hanging there for years. Calvin started looking through the cupboards and got to the photos. Nothing new had appeared in the family photo albums in years. The only embarrassing thing was that there were no pictures from his father-in-law and mother-in-law's wedding anywhere. Calvin found a small box in the corner of the cupboard and opened it. There were baby pictures of his father-in-law, of his parents. Everything was neatly signed and kept very carefully. Also in the box was a photograph of his father-in-law, Mr. Nicholas, in a suit. Standing next to him was a woman in a white wedding dress. Calvin thought it was probably just a snapshot from someone else's celebration. But the next thing he saw was footage of his father-in-law signing his name at the registry office. He looked at the date and frowned. No way, 6 months before Cassandra was born, her father had been married to another woman. Calvin carefully placed one of the pictures in his pocket. The others were just pictures he'd taken with his phone. He put everything back the way it was and left the house. Called Carl and told him what he had seen. He stepped into the role of detective. "How did you like my work?" he laughed. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't. There's really something about it. I'll come and see you tomorrow and look it over. There's something else that needs to be clarified." The next meeting was at a cafe. Calvin got out of the car wearing the white jumper that Cassandra adored and entered the establishment. "Hello. I have some news for you. Let's start with the video footage. Yesterday, your mother-in-law, Mrs. Annie, was meeting a man in a restaurant. The video footage showed an elderly man sitting down with Cassandra's mother, and they talk about something. And then he starts shouting. The words are a bit difficult to make out. What did he say to her? Calvin asked. He called her a creature, and she just apologized, said she was scared, that she was afraid for the kids. Then he just walked away, promising it wouldn't end that way. The children. What's going on in that family anyway? And who is that woman in the picture? Calvin clutched his head. I'll explain it all in a moment. Years ago, Mr. Nicholas and his wife, Mrs. Annie, came to work in a rich man's home. Justin and Elizabeth Johnsons had just married. They had two, their first child before they were married. It was a girl. Her name was Vivienne. Justin then married Elizabeth, and they had a second daughter less than a month after the first was born. Her name was Cassandra. Calvin's eyes rounded. Then what? There was a fire in the house, and one woman and two children died in it. Everyone claimed it was Elizabeth Johnson's and her daughters. But according to the case file, the girls' bodies were never found, and they were declared dead after they couldn't be found. So the woman in the photograph, Mrs. Annie, died. She was the woman in the photograph. Look how much she looks like Elizabeth. Carl showed Calvin the pictures from the newspaper where young Justin and Elizabeth had announced their engagement. I don't know that for sure and can only assume that Elizabeth was actually saved and her daughters were saved as well. That would explain why we see different women in the pictures. This is most likely Justin and Elizabeth's daughter, and Elizabeth is now living under the name of Mr. Nicholas' late wife. Calvin was completely confused. They talked for another hour, after which Calvin headed not home, but to his mother-in-law's house. Did you want something? She asked from the threshold. A word, Mrs. Annie, or should I call you Elizabeth? The woman ahead and covered her mouth with her hand. Mr. Nicholas came out of the kitchen with a red can of beer. I have a right to know the truth. What happened to my wife Cassandra? That was the main question. It was the one that kept bursting out. Your Cassandra is alive, Mr. Nicholas sighed. Calvin suddenly laughed. It was a stress response. What, as in alive? The mother-in-law looked at her husband. He knows everything. We need to tell him, or he'll make a mess of things. They walked into the small kitchen. Calvin sat down at the table and his mother-in-law made him some tea. Mrs. Annie and I worked for Johnson's for 3 years. We saw a lot of things in that time. He trusted us. My wife washed the blood off Justin's shirts, and I helped bury the bodies. He was a scary man. To be honest, I didn't marry Mrs. Annie for love. She lied about being pregnant. She was in love with me. When the truth came out, she swore she'd be the best wife she could be to me. And what about me? There was no divorce. Mrs. Annie was reliable. We lived quietly with her like everyone else, no fireworks. When this job came up, we went. We couldn't leave. Justin paid like nobody else ever paid. We were saving up for a flat, dreaming of actually having kids. Except it didn't work out that way. I fell in love. Elizabeth was fragile and mannered. She could support any conversation. She was just an extraordinary woman. I'd never seen anyone like her in my life. Justin loved her to bits. He would kill for her. And no one dared even come close to his woman. I was a young fool. I fell in love. And naturally, I couldn't resist. Elizabeth and I started seeing each other in secret. I knew I wouldn't last long, and Elizabeth knew it. Justin was jealous of her. But trouble came from where no one expected it. We were caught by Mrs. Annie. She was screaming, out of her mind. Said she was going to tell Justin all about Elizabeth and me, and we'd be killed. And I said I didn't care. I loved her so much, I was ready to give up my life. Mrs. Annie realized she couldn't hold me back, so she didn't say anything to Justin. She just kept quiet for a few days, and Elizabeth and I met in secret at the stables. I took care of his horses, knew the secret places where no one was supposed to find us. Only she found us. That night, Elizabeth's daughters were already asleep in the nursery. She came to my stable. Mrs. Annie followed us, locked the door and set fire to the stable. Only she miscalculated twice. The first time she thought I couldn't get out. I took Elizabeth out the back door. We took the horses out together. While we were doing that, the fire had already spread to the house. Elizabeth saw that the house was on fire and ran to save the girls. Vivian was already standing on the doorstep. I saw her carry her out and come back in, apparently burnt out when she realized what she'd done. It was her fault the whole house was on fire. I rushed after her and told Elizabeth to stay there. Only I didn't listen. Calvin's mother-in-law interjected into the conversation. I went in there and got not only my 1-year-old daughter out of the fire, but Nicholas as well. She saved me. The house started collapsing and we couldn't even call the fire department. There was nothing we could do anymore. I was sure Justin was going to die because he was drunk. That day he usually fell asleep in his office, where everything was made of animal skins. She died in the smoke. I couldn't see her, I couldn't save her. She wanted to keep us apart, and then she let us be together. Except we lived in fear the whole time. I kept waiting for Justin to come after me and kill me. Before the fire happened, I told him I wanted to leave. I was afraid of him. He's a real psycho, and this psycho loved me more than life. I knew he was capable of anything, just anything is scary. I knew Justin managed to get out, but he was badly burned. He also lost his memory. Couldn't remember who he was, where he was. He had bills that paid for his upkeep all this time. At first his friends and associates tried to treat him, taking him from one psychiatric hospital to another. His memory didn't come back. In the end, he stayed in a hospice. He certainly wasn't cared for like everyone else. I heard that his friends always came to see him. But over the years, many of them died, others went to prison. It was a bunch of real thugs, and my husband was their ringleader. I live under a false name and cringe every time I hear the name Justin Johnson's. Calvin shook his head. That's understandable. It's hard to believe that. But where is Cassandra? Why hasn't anyone told me anything? The thing is, Justin came out of hospice a month ago. He started reminiscing and started digging into our family. When it turned out we had a daughter named Cassandra growing up, he visited her. She told him about a strange uncle who made appointments for her and asked strange questions. That's when we realized we had to hide her, keep her safe. She's pregnant, Calvin. We told her gently and asked her to leave. Don't be angry. We did it to keep her alive so she wouldn't lose the baby. Who knows what Justin would have done and probably still will. He knows what I did. Found me in broad daylight. They picked me up on the street and put me straight. And there he was. I almost died of fright. And if they'd done that to Cassandra, it took her so long to get pregnant. What did he say to you in the car then? Calvin asked. Justin found me after talking to Cassandra. I told him the truth, that I had fallen in love with the gardener and was very afraid. Fear drives us to do crazy things. And I did a terrible thing. I'd left my eldest daughter Vivian at the orphanage. If Justin was looking for me after the fire, he'd be looking for a woman with 2 kids. I did it to protect her. I was afraid he'd just kill us all. And then Vivian would have been saved. I'm not exaggerating, Calvin. That man, when he found out I was cheating on him with the gardener, would kill his own daughter just to hurt me as much as possible. He was a complete psychopath. He didn't belong amongst people even then. Who knows what he'll get up to now? Mr. Nicholas nodded affirmatively. She's not exaggerating. It was the best decision. It's not like anyone knew Justin's memory would never come back. We lived all this time expecting him to come to kill us. But he didn't. And now he's found out. Mrs. Annie sighed. When he kidnapped me, I was sure I was going to be killed. But all he did was make me tell the truth. Of course, he didn't mistake me for Mrs. Annie. He realized I was living on someone else's identity. I told him everything, looking him straight in the eye. And Justin clenched his cheekbones. He apologized to me and said it was all his own fault. And he'd managed to track down our other daughter, Vivienne. I'd lost touch with her after I'd put her in an orphanage. I thought I'd visit her and then I'd pick her up. But she'd already been put up for adoption. Justin was mad at me for that. Said he wouldn't hurt the girls. He wouldn't hurt me either. But that's what he says now. Things might have been different back then. I found out that Vivian had died, leaving behind a little girl. Ironically, Cassandra already knew her. It turned out Vivian had been living very close by all this time. We'd been walking the same streets. We might have even met her. I'd been to her grave. That's when I went into hiding, because Justin started interfering in our lives. He found Vivian again, talked to her. I figured he was trying to gain her trust and get his daughter back. She already knew he was her father and that he was dangerous. She came home all pale, passed out. We faked her death and sent her to the village. Calvin stood up and started pacing back and forth. Nonsense. This is some kind of nonsense. It's not like he intended to hurt anyone. Why was that necessary? You put your first daughter in an orphanage out of your own fear, then faked your second daughter's death. So, did Justin fall for that trick? Left you alone? Mr. Nicholas shook his head. You don't understand. That man is dangerous. He shouldn't be anywhere near Cassandra. He was capable of anything even back then in the 90s. And now he's been in a hospice for years. Do you think he's got compassion or stopped being a psychopath? Yeah, I've seen him kill people, women, kill Calvin women, to get back at a man who owed him money. And he loved it. If you knew him, you'd realize we did the right thing. Justin took me out to a restaurant recently and told me he didn't believe in this death circus. Said he was going to find her anyway and get revenge on us. Okay, one last question. Linda is Vivian's daughter. Am I understanding this correctly? How did you find her? Mrs. Annie nodded affirmatively, rubbing her hands together nervously. It came out by accident. But when we told her everything, she wanted to adopt her. We explained that it wasn't safe, that it wasn't the time. Calvin was tired of listening to all this nonsense. He found out the address where he could find his not at all deceased wife and rushed there. The village was 170 kilometers from the city. He arrived a few hours later, found the cabin and went in. They told you, Cassandra threw herself around his neck. Calvin pulled her against him and tears rolled down her cheeks on their own. Cassandra was crying as well. I'm sorry, please forgive me. I told them it wasn't right. But will they listen to me? Calvin stroked her face with his hands, unable to believe that this was all real. God, it really is you. I'm just afraid to wake up right now. Afraid that this is all going to turn out to be a dream. No, it's not a dream. I'm alive. I'm with you. Everything's going to be all right. They forbade me to look for you. An hour later, they were drinking coffee in a small, modest kitchen. Outside the window, a snowstorm was beginning. Your parents are scared to death. What do you think yourself? Is this Justin really that dangerous? He asked. I don't. If what my dad told me is true, then yeah, he's not all right in the head, it seems. But I've seen him in person. And in my opinion, just a sick old man with a broken fate. If he's a murderer, your parents are understandable. They must have lived in fear all their lives. That fear is why I never got to see my sister. I met Linda by chance. She was so sweet, out on the playground playing. Some boys were hurting her, and I stepped in. Ever since then, whenever she saw me, she always ran to say hello, gave me drawings. I found out she didn't have a mum. I guess I heard the call of the blood because I just fell in love with this girl. I wanted to adopt her so badly. But I hesitated until my parents told me she was Vivian's daughter. That was after my mum met Justin for the first time. He showed her pictures, threw the phrase in her face that she had killed Vivienne by leaving her at the orphanage. Her life hadn't worked out. He made inquiries. Apparently, there were some good connections. Mum looked for her too, but couldn't find her. When I found out Linda was my niece, I went to her dad. I lied about knowing Vivian and asked him to tell me about her. He didn't mind if I took the girl. He's not interested in her. He's a heavy drinker. Quiet though he is, he doesn't hit her. But he doesn't have time to look after her. Linda's going to end up in a foster home. We have to get her before Justin does. I think he's going to want her, and there's no stopping him. He's got a lot of money, and money solves these things. Calvin held Cassandra's hand. What's your month? He asked. She smiled. 3rd. I didn't know at first. And when I found out, my parents said I needed to be hidden. I was scared. The baby was afraid Justin might hurt me, and there would be a miscarriage. My parents intimidated me, scared themselves, made me agree to this whole circus. I think it's a lot simpler than it sounds. I'm going to find this Justin and talk to him myself. You can't live like this. You can't be afraid and hide your whole life. The man had a memory. Maybe he just wanted to know what happened to the people he loved. He didn't know your mum was in love with someone else. He didn't know anything. I even feel sorry for him. I'll talk to him. Cassandra was against it, but Calvin forbade her to worry and told her not to go anywhere. He returned home in the dark. The road was covered with snow. Winter was rampant everywhere. Calvin entered her warm flat and smiled. On the mirror lay her makeup. Now he knew for sure that Cassandra would soon be home and using it all. Her things no longer looked neglected. The pain subsided as if a sore tooth had been pulled. In the morning, Calvin made inquiries about this Justin. He read the information online. Apparently they were afraid to even write about him. He found out the address where he could be found and drove to a small private house in the center of town. Calvin boldly pressed the bell, and the owner himself opened the door. He was a hunched, gray-haired old man with an unhealthy complexion. Is he dangerous? He thought at that moment. I expected you would come. Come in, said Justin. He talked like a hardened gangster. Justin led him inside, and it was just like Mr. Nicholas's story. Deer heads, leather sofas. Apparently, after his stay in the hospice, he wanted to surround himself with beautiful things, to his taste. You were expecting me, Kelvin wondered. I was waiting. You're not a fool to believe all this farce. Or did you think I wouldn't find out who my only daughter was living with? Of course I found out about you. You're too honest and open with your business. They'll eat you up. You shouldn't do that. Calvin was amazed. This man had a knack for inquiry too. Really, you're my father-in-law, Calvin shook his head. He wasn't afraid of this man, but the possibilities amazed him. They told you, that fool Elizabeth. All her life she ran from me. though no one ever caught up with her. I was always in plain sight. She used to visit me, came to see me from behind the glass. She was afraid if she saw me, I'd remember everything. And I did. Except it wasn't her prayers that made me die. The disease must have kicked in and my memory came back to me. All I wanted was to know my daughters one last time. Yes, I did terrible things when I was younger, but I'm not what I used to be. Why did they do this to Mr. Nicholas? I knew that very day where they'd taken him and why. Soon I'll be a great-grandfather. Except I won't get the baby. They won't give me more than 2 months. That's the way it is. Calvin was amazed. That's what happens when you recognize a situation from the other side. So you're not going to take revenge on Elizabeth, or rather Mrs. Annie? The host smirked. No, but she was right. If my memory had come back to me then, I don't know what I would have done with them. And the girls were in danger too. When I was in a rage, I had no control at all. So it wasn't my fault anyway. Son, bring Cassandra to me. I won't hurt her. Let her recognize her own father. Let her not be afraid of me. I want to end it all. End it all. Everyone living as peacefully as possible after everything that's happened. I just wanted to apologize, to tell you how it really happened. Yes, I am what I am, and there's nothing I can do about it in my old age. Nature made me this way, but I'm not a monster, no matter what Elizabeth or Mrs. Annie says, and I fell in love with a fool. Calvin smiled. You still love her? He realized. Justin smiled back. I do. How can you fall out of love when you've truly loved? Calvin shook his head. He would never fall out of love with Cassandra. He drove from Justin's house thinking he was the son-in-law of a real criminal mastermind. Wow. As he fell asleep, Calvin remembered how hard it had been in the days when he thought Cassandra was dead. I guess he needed that lesson for some reason, since fate had taught it. Perhaps he should appreciate it more, especially now that Cassandra is expecting a child. Calvin and Cassandra didn't say anything to their parents. They arrived at Justin's house alone. Have I really lived to see this moment? He asked. There were tears in his eyes. Come on in, daughter. Cassandra acted wary, but quickly realized there was no danger. Her father told her his whole story, telling her who his now deceased parents were and telling her why he had become so violent. When I was young, I was an ordinary boy. I never hurt others. It was more like I was hurt. When I grew up, I had ambitions. My family was poor, my mother needed an operation, and I had no money. So I decided to start a scam. Cheating, of course, stealing. But there was no other way to make a quick buck. I made the deal. It paid off. I got my hands on a lot of money. I had the surgery, I was saved. My mate Clark offered me the same scheme to make money again, and I took him up on it. Why not? We got lucky this time, too. We started switching cities, following the same pattern. And when we decided to make a big score, Clark got scared. I did it all by myself, and he stalked me and told me to share the money. Put a knife to my throat and told me to give him everything. It was his scheme, and I did. But after that, I started acting alone and always carried my dad's knife. Now I was ready. We became competitors, and a few years later, we both went into business together. Clark and I were competing for the same niche. Only one of us had a chance. I jumped at it, but Clark was stronger, had more money invested in his business. He had a tougher defense. So to get around him, I went rogue. I swindled him out of his money and raised my own. After all, it's a business. He took my money from me. I took his business from him, fair and square. Except Clark didn't see it that way. I came home that day and found my mom and dad lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and he even left me a note. I was the closest thing I had to a mother. I respected and loved my father. I guess that's what made me like that. What happened to Clark? Cassandra asked, afraid to hear the truth. What happened to him? He was killed with his father's knife, and all his associates who stood up for him. I was no longer afraid of anyone or anything. I'd been living my life for so many years with no breaks. I'd taken over the whole town. I had nothing left to lose. And when I fell in love with Elizabeth, she became my weakness. I became even more afraid. If I felt threatened, I didn't ask, I shot. I was just afraid someone would do to her what they did to my parents. Why should I lose loved ones because I'm successful? If I was threatened, I just dealt with it. That's why there was so much bloodshed. I was just protecting my family. Isn't that what everyone does? Calvin heard him and understood. Yes, one could understand him in some ways, both his actions and why he had become like this. It was the 90s. Everyone was scared, hurting, hard, and he was above it all. Himself rising from poverty to the richest man in town. That doesn't justify murder, of course, but you can't change the past, and you can't change anything. Cassandra returned home. She had a fight with her mum over it. Stay away from him. Why did you go to him? But he knew where I was from the beginning. Enough already. You can't fool him, you can't outplay him. He doesn't mean any harm. If he wanted to, he would have done it long ago. He only wants to make up, and he's dying. It was very difficult to persuade Mum to come to see her father, but Cassandra succeeded. No one wanted to argue with a pregnant woman. She brought her to him, and they had a long, detailed conversation. "I won't call you Mrs. Annie, if you don't mind," Justin said. "Okay. I'm sorry. I was such a bad husband that I made you live your life in fear. I didn't want that, did I? I loved you and I love you and I protected you. You wouldn't understand that, though." They sat before each other, aged, wrinkled, no longer the same as when they were young. Only the eyes were the same. Still the same young soul in them. "I'm sorry, too. We've done some stupid things. Let's make up for it the best we can. I'm leaving everything to Cassandra and Linda. My daughter's already doing the paperwork. The girl's father's been arranged. Bitter drunk. What can I take from him?" "You didn't intimidate him, did you?" she asked. "No, I didn't have to. It's been so many years, Elizabeth. I haven't killed anyone since '96. And you're still scared?" The conversation dragged on. They didn't become friends afterwards, but they remembered former feelings. Still, they had been a loving husband and wife once. Elizabeth realized that now Justin was no longer a threat. The very next day, she went to the passport office and asked to have her name changed. She was used to being Mrs. Annie by now, but she wanted to be herself. It meant an end to her fears, an end to her torment and suffering. Her eldest daughter had grown up in a strange family because of them, never recognizing her mother. A year passed. It was a momentous one for everyone in the family. The family grew larger, reunited, grew. There were losses during that year. After that meeting, Justin lived another 4.5 months. He was happy to have his daughter by his side. Justin's connections helped Cassandra get the paperwork done quickly and take Linda in with her. She turned out to be incredibly like her mother, Justin said. The girl lived with him until he became ill. Then he forbade himself to visit. He was cared for by a nurse. Justin did not like hospitals, said he wanted to die at home, alone, without bothering anyone. He'd made all the arrangements himself beforehand. Everything was ready for his funeral. He died 3 weeks after he stopped getting up. Cassandra called him until the last minute. She was the only person he spoke to in the last days of his life. Justin was out of it. And Cassandra came. He was out of it and probably didn't even realize that his last-minute daughter was holding his hand tightly. It was exactly what he really wanted, but was afraid to traumatize her with his condition. Elizabeth and Mr. Nicholas came to the funeral as well. Everyone was there. And just 3 weeks after the funeral, Cassandra gave birth to a baby boy. Elizabeth was adamantly opposed to the idea, and Calvin wasn't too keen on the idea. But the baby was named Justin in honor of his grandfather. "You give the child your last name, your middle name." "Let me at least name him since I carried him and gave birth to him," she resented. Calvin only chuckled. She was so amused by her swearing. "As long as he's healthy. And don't kill people," he joked. Elizabeth could hardly forgive her ex-husband for years of torment and her fear-driven behavior. But Cassandra had managed to grow attached to him in that short period of time. Blood called, and there was nothing she could do about it. She was afraid of offending the father who had raised her. Mr. Nicholas was neutral about it. To him, she was forever his own daughter. Cassandra said she just had two dads now. That was all. Linda quickly got used to calling Cassandra Mom and Calvin Dad. Her real father was glad to be rid of his daughter, moved somewhere else, and never even called once. Actually, that was exactly what Calvin and Cassandra wanted. They became parents to two children at once. Linda loved going out with Justin, always asking her mom to give the pram to her. She adored him and said he was the best and her favorite little brother. "I want a baby sister. Will you have a baby sister for me?" Linda asked. Cassandra only shook her head. "Wait, let's let Justin grow up first and then we can think about a baby sister." "I want a second daughter too," Calvin interjected into the conversation. He'd always wanted many children, but since Cassandra had been unable to conceive for a long time, he'd later said goodbye to his dream. Even if she had turned out to be infertile, he would not have loved her any less. However, heaven had blessed them. And it seems that the desire to take Linda played no small part in the pregnancy. Calvin loved going out with his daughter. He tried to spoil her with the attention she had not received from her birth father. Children are very adaptable, and Linda quickly got used to the good attitude, attention to a completely different life. Here she did not have to eat from time to time and wash her own clothes. In addition, during this year there was also a move. Justin had left them all his wealth to Cassandra and Linda, who lived without knowing that she was already wealthy for life. Cassandra opened her own design firm and quickly became a success. She no longer had to work for someone else. No one controlled her. She was her own boss, and not only herself. Gradually, the firm had a staff of 10 people who helped Cassandra. She was happy and often came to visit her father's grave. He ordered that he be buried next to his daughter, and his will was certainly carried out. Elizabeth nursed her grandchildren and lived her life as before, only now without fears. Those around her did not know the reason for her name change. To them, it was something akin to an old woman's quirk. Many people continued to call her Mrs. Annie, and she did not take offense or bring it up. She and Mr. Nicholas were finally living happily ever after. "I'm the boss now, and it's up to me to decide who to appoint to positions." Emily looked angrily at the clinic's head doctor. "But you don't know anything about this. You'll ruin the whole business," the man gritted his teeth angrily. "Father thought I could handle it," she replied. "And your opinion is secondary here. Speak it to someone else." Ever since she was a little girl, Emily had known Daddy was not to be disturbed. He has an important and complicated job. John Smith, a gifted surgeon, was the star of his course and was rapidly advancing in his career. One of the first in the region, he opened his own private clinic and then divorced Emily's mom. An ordinary kindergarten teacher, she no longer fit his status. Instead, girls of a certain kind, with long legs, plump lips, and luxurious hair, appeared next to her father. Of course, Emily's mother, Sarah, hard to survive the divorce. She forbade her daughter to communicate with her father. They saw each other rarely secretly. She didn't want to offend her mom. Emily, however, was also hurting from her dad leaving the family. At their school, the best in their town, it was not customary to be different from others. Most of her classmates were brought in expensive cars, and Emily walked to school in the rain and snow. Also, her father, though he paid child support, officially withdrew the money. Mom reluctantly saved her daughters for a better life. They lived on a teacher's salary while their peers wore fancy sweaters and bought gum in different flavors. Emily wore a trademark scratchy brown dress with a white collar. Her mom explained to her the main thing is what a person has inside in the soul, in the head, and the outside is superfluous, like beauty. Today you have it, tomorrow you don't. But I want to be beautiful now. Like everyone else, Emily pleaded. My classmates laugh, they tease me as an old maid. Mom, I'm the only one who wears a braid and a dress. Remember, not everything in this world is measured by the amount of money. Your classmates are all blousy figures with daddy's money. And look deeper, they're insecure teenagers. Emily tried to ignore the taunts. But it wasn't easy. She remembered her high school years with a shudder for a long time to come. She never went to homecoming, studied after the 9th grade in the pedagogical school, and then went by the example of her mother teacher in a kindergarten. Emily kids just adored. She had a clear talent to listen and understand everyone. But everything in her life changed in an instant. She was 27 when her daddy died. He died on vacation, crashed in a helicopter on a fishing trip. He'd been seriously ill for a year before that. Almost retired from his business, went on vacation to celebrate his recovery. But it turned out differently. The relatives received the remains in a closed coffin. Emily and her mom took care of the funeral. The father never remarried. His daughter was the sole heir to everything: an apartment, bank accounts, and a private clinic. After the funeral, Emily took care of the inheritance. She was invited to her notary, Michael, who was in charge of her father's affairs, told about all the property that passed to the young woman, and then added, "I was not only an attorney, but a friend of your father, Emily. And I want to tell you, he was especially worried about the clinic. Of course, my friend hoped his daughter would carry on his business, not pass it on to anyone else. But I don't know anything about it." Emily sighed. "The business would die much faster under my management than it would thrive. Well, the most I can manage is a staff of toddlers. Believe me, doctors aren't much different from them," the notary laughed. "And then, the clinic isn't specialized. There's a head doctor there, you'll get used to it, you'll figure it out, you'll calmly deal with administrative issues. Of course, your father dreamed that his daughter will connect her life with medicine. But with your choice, he accepted. So consider this a kind of blessing from him, a loan of trust from Dad." I'm really scared," Emily admitted. "But I guess I'll have to try it. I warn you, I don't know anything about documents either." After the visit to the notary, Emily drove to her father's apartment, which she was getting. She didn't feel it was hers yet. In the evening, she met with her fiancé, Tom. After learning of the inheritance, the latter had become more attentive to her, although the young people had dated for a couple of years before, and Tom had even insisted on marrying her. "Emily, how have you been to the notary?" Tom asked his beloved. "Yeah, starting on the inheritance. God, I still can't believe Daddy's gone. Maybe there's some terrible mistake. What if he's alive?" "But you did a DNA test for identification. There can't be a mistake." "What about the inheritance?" Tom inquired. "The notary is particularly insistent that I should take over the clinic," Emily complained. "But I so don't want to do that. It's not like I'm Dad, I don't know anything about medicine at all. He was the one who was a genius, operated flawlessly." "It's all right, you'll figure it out," Tom replied. "But the money will flow. Imagine what a private clinic brings in. There's a lot of money going around." "Oh, do you know what the responsibility is?" "Tom, I remember when Dad was always complaining about problems. He used to talk a lot about how difficult it was to manage a big team. You know what he used to call his doctors? A ball of snakes. And he said the emblem of medicine wasn't chosen by accident." "You what? Do you really want to give it all up? And then who would inherit my father's business and estate?" "No, really. I can't let Dad down. I'm just a little afraid of the huge responsibility," Emily sighed. "I mean, it's an established team of adults and I'm coming in to manage them. It's not going to be easy to handle, and it's going to be hard to put myself in charge." "It's okay. I'll be there for you," Tom comforted her. "I'll always be there to help, to support." "Thank you," the bride smiled. "I know I can count on you." A month later, Emily already had all the title transfer papers in hand. She hadn't even dared to go into the clinic without them, and now she calmly came in and claimed her rights. The girl at the receptionist's desk stared at her fearfully when Emily demanded the keys to her father's office. "I can't give them to you." "Hold on, I'll get the head doctor." "What do you mean you can't?" "I own this clinic and I'm your direct supervisor," Emily said angrily. "You're not supposed to anyway," the girl squeaked and blushed. "I'll get my supervisor right away. You can take it up with him." She ran off down the corridor and returned, accompanied by a large, scowling man. He looked displeased, as if Emily had torn this important man away from something equally important. "What do we have here? Who are you, girl, anyway? Are you scaring the staff at me? I can actually call the police right now, security. Leave the premises immediately." "Allow me to introduce myself. Smith Emily, owner of this clinic." On what grounds the head doctor was outraged. "We weren't warned. In fact, let me see some ID." "What are you guys doing, holding seances?" Emily grinned. "How else could we have gotten a warning? My dad's dead. He can't exactly tell you anything anymore." "Your jokes are stupid." Just like John, the head doctor grumbled, looking at the paperwork. "It's all in the father, I can tell the daughter." "Well, come on, I'll show you around. You won't be coming here much, will you?" "On the contrary. I'll be here every day." "That was Papa's will," Emily smiled. "By the way, you haven't introduced yourself." Ben, the head doctor, muttered. "I can't say I'm very pleased, but the clinic can't operate for long without a leader either. By the way, now that you've shown up here, sign our payrolls and estimates for next month's medications. We're almost out of stock, and people are working for you, dear clinic owner. For the second month without a paycheck." Emily nodded. She got the keys to the office, went inside, and turned on the computer. They shared the same password and login, the kind of joke game that had united father and daughter for years. Then she invited the secretary and accountant to her office. With them were solved the main organizational issues, signed papers, long awaited their turn. Her father's secretary, the sweetest Deborah, kept sighing and talking about Emily's resemblance to her father. It irritated the young woman a little, but she tolerated it. Deborah was very much appreciated by her father for her organizational skills. The accountant left. Emily immersed herself in scheduling. Together with the secretary, it was decided to convene a council with the department heads before evening. Outside the office doors, all day Emily heard a joyful buzz. The employees began to receive their paychecks, delayed because of the owner's departure. Everyone was revitalized, walking around in high spirits. And in the evening at the meeting of the new owner was presented a report. It showed that the clinic was doing just fine, but it didn't match the data that my father had in his computer. The chief physician added fuel to the fire. "I think I would be expressing a general opinion if I said that you don't have to run the clinic yourself. This month has shown that we are doing quite well, and if you trust me to run it, you won't regret it." Ben, Emily replied, "I appreciate your willingness to cooperate, but I'll be running the clinic myself. It's what Dad wanted, and his last wishes must be honored." "But you're a medical nut," the chief medical officer said indignantly. "What kind of leader are you? Ruin the clinic, that's all." "I dare say, Ben." Emily replied, "You're also a doctor, not a manager. And my purview is not your purview at all. If you don't like something, please report to my office. By the way, the clinic will be fully audited this year. I'm warning everyone right away, so there won't be any surprises. I need to know. As the new owner, what a cat in a bag I got." Everyone left. Only the on-duty shift remained in the clinic, and Emily walked the corridors for a while, peering into the rooms. In one of the back rooms, she suddenly found a young girl setting up a cot. She was startled by Emily's appearance. "Are you going to sleep here?" marveled the clinic owner. "What do you mean?" "I'm sorry," treated the girl, almost crying. "My name is Kelly. I work here as a nurse. You see, the landlady kicked me out with my stuff, and there was no paycheck. And without money, there's nowhere to go. I'm from out of town. I was working here at the state hospital, and then Ben called me. I was a paid nurse in his ward. And you have a medical background, clarified Emily. Yes, it's all about personnel. There's a copy of my diploma. You don't think I'm just really sleeping here because there's nowhere else? Ours laugh, of course. Well, I'm used to it. I've never been considered a human being. The daughter of alcoholics. What good is that? They may be small-minded, but I'm honest and efficient. Kelly, how do you think things are going at the clinic? Asked Emily unexpectedly, as someone on the inside of the situation. You know, it's not my first day here, and things aren't great, to be honest, Kelly admitted. There's a shortage of medications, the equipment is aging, the CT scanner should have been repaired a long time ago, or better yet, scrapped. Doctors don't stick around. Well, except for the sane, ready to gnaw on any occasion to organize. And the good ones are quickly left behind. Stats are attributed, they cover up mistakes. That's what they do in any hospital. But here, it's just like that. Wow. I got such a rosy picture of everything. Emily smiled. I suspected it wasn't all, and my dad told me about it, shared it. But for it to be this bad, I'm surprised. Okay, Kelly, good night. See you later. Wait, there's one more thing I wanted to tell you, the nurse stopped her. We had a guy admitted yesterday. They found him in the yard by the garbage cans, all beat up, dressed like a homeless guy. Not transportable, of course, which is the only reason he's still here. Otherwise, he'd have been turned over to free medical care a long time ago. There's no one to pay for a guy like that. In fact, your daddy had a social ward here since the clinic was founded. They took in just such patients for charity, and now no one wants to take him on, and we don't know who's going to pay for it. Roger that, Emily replied. I'll be sure to deal with it tomorrow. Don't worry about it. The next day, Emily went to quit her job at the daycare center. The first day, it became clear that her father's clinic would take up almost all of her time. After writing her notice, she went to say goodbye to her little ones in the group. They were literally crying and clinging to their favorite teacher. Emily promised them that she would definitely come to visit. With a heavy heart, she left the kindergarten, where she had worked for the past few years, and went to the clinic. There, Emily happened to witness one unpleasant scene. Several nurses stood and taunted Kelly, and she didn't respond, huddled in a corner. What do you think? You're going to live here unhindered? We'll tell the management in no time. You're the smart one. Homeless people are no better than the ones we found by the dumpsters yesterday. You stink, you stink. You feel that, girls? I'm not homeless, Kelly almost cried. So what? You're on duty for us tonight? On the night shift? You're sleeping anyway. At least you'll be useful. And don't you dare complain to the head doctor. What's going on here? Emily stepped toward them. The women scrambled away. Only Kelly stood back. You'll find it. Let's go have some coffee with you in the morning. The rest of you, get to work. Just give me your last name so I know who to reprimand. Where are we going to work? The nurses answered her. And if you're talking about Kelly, we're just joking around in the office. That's what we do to lighten the mood. I can see that. You heard her again. You're out. And under such an article that they won't take you anywhere else, Emily threatened. She lives here with my personal permission and will take the shower if she needs to, whenever she wants to. Oh, you shouldn't do that, Kelly told her quietly as the nurses left. They're definitely going to hound me now. I don't think so, Emily grinned. They'll be more like friends. But don't get your hopes up. You know this is a temporary situation. They went to her office, had a cup of coffee and some cakes Emily had bought on the way in. Then Kelly went to work, and word of her friendship with her new boss spread quickly through the floors. Emily demanded to see the head doctor and the department heads. When everyone was assembled, she asked sternly, I take it everyone here has long since forgotten their oath of office. "What are you talking about?" Emily, the head doctor, replied through gritted teeth. "You don't use words like that." "Then how do you understand your behavior unworthy of the title of doctor?" "Ben, a patient with a complex of problems is lying in the department for the third day, and no one's even going to treat him. Do we wait until he's dead and we get sued for not treating him?" "Come on, it's a homeless guy," the head doctor grinned. "Who cares about him?" "Like me," Emily replied, angrily looking at him. "What's your treatment plan?" "Oh, come on." "Like you know anything about it," Ben continued to push his line. "It's not going to die today, it's going to die tomorrow. There's a whole host of problems." "Then do something about it, instead of making up stuff." "In general, Ben, I'm very unhappy with you," Emily declared. "Of course, while Dad was sick, everyone here relaxed. And then he died. And you can do anything you want. I'm warning you right away, it won't happen again. There's a consult at the patient's bedside in an hour. And don't tell me there's no way to save him. If this man dies, your careers and reputations will die too. I've said it all." "What a bitch," just like her father, someone in the crowd hissed. But no one dared to argue. Leaving her office, Ben looked at the young woman with hatred. Who the hell was she? Just another upstart, the daughter of a rich daddy. And he, an honored doctor, should be jumping on his hind legs in front of her. Of course, her father's been ripped off. A lot. By all kinds of people. Ben himself had long had a big, successful business reselling drugs from the clinic. But now it seemed that source of easy money was coming to an end. An hour later, there was indeed a meeting at the patient's bedside. Almost all the doctors thought he was hopeless. It was necessary to appoint someone who would be responsible in case of a bad outcome. The choice fell on a young doctor named Kevin, a recent medical school graduate. "You're the man for the job," said the head doctor. "Prove you're worth something, or you're just taking up space on the staff." "Yes, you get the money, but I'm afraid of hurting you," Kevin warned. "You know? I mean, there's no room on him." "Don't worry, colleague, I've got your back," replied Ben, who wasn't really looking to protect anyone. He just needed a convenient scapegoat. Kevin stayed in the room. He continued to examine the patient, made his appointments and dictated them to Kelly, asking her to pay special attention to the patient, even though she spent all her free time in the unnamed guy's room. There were no papers on him, and he wasn't conscious. "Doctor, is he going to be okay?" the mother asked. "He's so young. I feel so sorry for the boy." "I don't know. The beatings are bad. But we'll fight for him," Kevin replied optimistically. "Keep an eye on the kid. Report any changes in his condition to me. If there's a chance, there's not much time. Within 24 hours, Jack, our unnamed one, will regain consciousness or die." By late afternoon, driving home, Emily realized how tired she was. Running the clinic took a lot of energy and left little time for a personal life, or even a semblance of one. At home, her fiancé Tom was waiting for her. "Well, you're not taking care of yourself at all," he reprimanded her. "I understand it's a new case, but you've got to manage your time." "Tom, let's not lecture." "I'm so tired," Emily begged her lover. "Is there something you wanted?" "Of course, to see you." "I miss you," Tom replied. "And actually, let's get married. In official status, I'll be able to help you at the clinic." "Oh, don't start." "Okay," Emily begged him. "I'll do without outside help. It's my business. Daddy wanted his daughter to be the one to continue it. And for you, the clinic is just a huge, profitable business." "That's not how it works. It's more complicated than that." "All right, I'll stay out of it. What's stopping us from just getting married?" "Tom, please. I'm fine right now. I'm so tired," Emily pleaded. "Just give me a chance to recover." The annoyed groom left, and Sarah began feeding her daughter and asking about how the day had gone. In between, she asked a question. What? Is he asking you to get married again? Yes. I'm tired of explaining to him that it's not the right time, Emily sighed. And he keeps insisting. Take your time, daughter. That Tom is so slippery. I've never liked him. And now that you're a bride with money, you have to be even more careful. Who knows what the groom's plans are? Mom, calm down. I'm in no hurry, as it is, Sarah assured her daughter. That's it. I'm going to bed. Emily arrived at the clinic early in the morning, but didn't find Kelly in her cubbyhole. The emergency room said the girl was on duty at the bedside of an unnamed patient with the doctor. Emily went to the room. So how are we doing here today? She asked cheerfully. Is there any hope, or are we giving up? There's definitely one. Kelly's a wizard, the young doctor smiled at her. I'm going to have to ask you to write her a bonus. As it is, we're still a long way from an optimistic prognosis. But we've stabilized the patient. We'll keep treating her. That's good. Yesterday at the meeting they were telling me he was hopeless. Your name is Kevin, right? Yes, that's right. Report to me personally on the patient's condition on a daily basis. And you, Kelly, are under my personal orders to be assigned to this ward for the time being. Don't get distracted by the routine. There's someone in the clinic to take care of it. Kelly nodded in response, and Emily walked further into the office. A new day had begun with its surprises. 24 hours later, the very hopeless nameless came to his senses, opening his eyes. Kelly immediately rushed to call the doctor and Emily. They came in, assessed the guy's condition. He was clearly on the mend, though he couldn't speak clearly. You're doing great, Kevin. Emily smiled. It was easy to handle such a task. Would you like to take over the department? I need reliable, trustworthy people. I don't even have much experience, he said, embarrassed. And then what will the others say? We'll figure it out, Emily smiled. Wait, there will be an official appointment within a day. Leaving Kevin and Kelly to deal with the patients, she went to her office and called the chief physician. He came in and immediately recognized the change in personnel. Well, let's start cleaning up our ranks, Emily told him with a smile. Here, Kevin is appointed head of the Department of Traumatology and Surgery. Are you crazy, Emily? The head doctor snapped at her. He's been out of school for a week. What department? We have doctors with 20 years of service on the rank and file. And you, too, if you don't understand words, Emily grinned. You want to confront me? You better find another job. Come on, what don't I understand? Ben backed down. But you should know that I'm not going to cover other people's medical mistakes. Let your child prodigy deal with them on his own. Emily nodded. At the same time, Tom burst into the office, ignoring the intruders. He kissed his bride and said, but we're not being led at all. I'm ready to work at your clinic. I'm ready to work at your clinic. I'm ready to work at anything, just to be close to you. Tom, you're just a driver, she smiled. Let's ask the head doctor. Do we need someone for this position? Ben, a second field driver will not hurt, answered the chief physician. The staff can't cope. We often do home examinations after discharge and send medicines to patients as prescribed. Well then, so we'll do it that way. You'll be a driver for a while, Emily said. Go ahead and book it. I'll let HR know. I'll walk you out, Ben said. I hope you don't make him superintendent. You're kidding, Emily laughed. No, don't worry. It's all clear from the start. By the way, I'd like you to meet my fiancée. Ben nodded and walked out of the office with Tom. He recognized this man as a young man looking for profit and began to seduce him with possible benefits. After waiting for Tom to complete the paperwork, Ben took him up on it. Look, I see you're a man of business and intelligence. The chief physician began the conversation. Well, yes, Tom confirmed I am. Well, I have a business proposal. Of course, we won't talk about it much, but you will have a chance to earn good money quickly and almost safely. I'll take it. What should I do? Tom answered at once. They discussed for some time what he was going to do. Then they parted, exchanging phone numbers. The head doctor assured that his fiancée would never find out. Meanwhile, the nameless drifter had a name. He had recovered enough to speak, and at this very moment he was answering his attendings' questions. Kelly ran to call Emily. The situation demanded her presence. The new mistress entered the room and heard. "My name is Adam Norton. Listen, call your father." I dictated the phone number. "He must be going crazy tonight. What's the date, anyway?" "Okay, Adam. We'll be sure to call," Kevin assured the patient. "Why don't you tell us how you ended up on the street?" "It's kind of complicated." He tried to smile with dry, cracked lips. "You see, my father is very rich. Steve Norton. I'm sure you've heard of him. Well, he's been paranoid lately. He's been yelling about me disgracing his family name. And I can't last a day without money. So we had a bet. I had to prove to my dad that I could do it. Survive without money. You know, like a test or something. We agreed on a month." "You rich people have funny quirks," Kevin said. "How did you end up on the street?" "That's what I'm getting at," Adam said. "You see, it turned out that at some point I became my own man among the vagrants, relaxed, let my guard down, said something wrong. Anyway, they attacked me in a crowd and almost killed me. Violence is more the norm among them, so it was expected, but I was sure I was in control of the situation." "Sounds like you've been playing a little too hard to get." Adam Norton Kevin chuckled. "Now I'll have to get new teeth, and probably have to have my septum repaired too. It's been a life or death situation." Emily went to call Adam's father, who still believed his son was still going through his ordeal. Upon hearing that his son was in the hospital, Steve immediately rushed over. "Thank you so much. Not every clinic owner is capable of such mercy." After all, Adam made a decidedly repulsive impression in his character as a homeless man. The boy's father thanked Emily. "Well, I wasn't always wealthy either, so I view all patients as equal in status. How did you even allow this to happen? I mean, it's native blood. He could have easily died on the street," she scolded her father. "Yes, I realize that now. And in general, it was uneasy in my heart these days. The old fool decided to organize an inspection, and we should have just talked." "Well, you'll have time to mend relations," Emily smiled. "And I also want to ask you to be nice to Nurse Kelly. She did a lot to save Adam, literally never left his bedside. Do I understand you?" Of course, Steve smiled. "No offense to a good professional. And to you, Emily, I'm very grateful. Any complications arise, feel free to contact me. You understand, rumors spread quickly. I haven't met your father personally, but I've heard a lot, and I can already see that my daughter is a worthy heiress." They said goodbye, and Emily escorted Steve to her son's room. Upon learning that their homeless man was a rich man disguised as a vagrant, the entire clinic came running to see him. The doctors were ready to literally fight for the right to observe him, but Kevin and Kelly held their ground. Emily pulled the young doctor aside. "Kevin, you do realize what's going on, don't you?" she smiled. "Now everyone is going to be here giving you advice and trying to gain your trust. Please remain loyal to me. I know how to remember the good." "Of course. Come now, Emily. I have little sympathy for this tangle of schemers on the whole. You, on the other hand, are the opposite." "Well, good," Emily stated. "Come by the office anytime. I'm ready to discuss any controversial or questionable issues in person. The main thing, Kevin, is to stand your ground. Don't let anyone change your assignments or anything like that." "Right, of course," the young doctor smiled. Emily walked back to her room and smiled. She liked Kevin, a good-looking guy. A young woman who wanted some attention too, but there was no time to think about romance at work. The situation at the clinic wasn't the easiest as it was. Slowly sorting out the supply of medicines and other administrative moments, Emily realized that there were just huge leaks in the budget of the clinic. And they appeared just in the same year when her father was ill, and she had to deal with it. In the meantime, the head doctor gradually drew the naive and stupid, but very greedy Tom deeper into his scams. He felt the taste of easy money and literally asked to participate in more and more dubious cases. And Ben was only glad to have such an accomplice. He'd planned to blame it on Tom if it all came to light. And he wasn't going to wait for an audit. The head doctor had plans of his own. He wanted to quickly change the clinic under the pretext of moving to another city and escape with the stolen goods. But these dreams were prevented from coming true by Kelly, a nurse, who was again habitually ignored by everyone. One day she caught the head doctor and the new driver for the realization of their plans. She was shocked at such brazen theft and had already gone to Emily's office in the morning. It's none of my business, of course, but the meds were just brought in. Ben and that new driver Tom are already hauling them out of the warehouse in boxes, Emily. Something has to be done. That's a lot of expensive medicine to account for. Who's going to be responsible for it in the end? They'll just write it off as expired again. Is that what they do in our clinic, Emily wondered. You see, I'm a complete novice at this sort of thing. Are you sure it was the new driver who was there? Well, yes. I saw them with my own eyes and heard the conversation, Kelly confirmed. Do you need proof? That would be nice. After all, words alone aren't going to be enough. And we've just scared off those thieves by checking the warehouse, Emily replied absent-mindedly. So the kids are something I need to think about for the first few minutes. It seemed to Emily that her fiancé was incapable of such treachery. But then she remembered how greedy Tom had been and realized it was just like him. All she had to do was figure out how to nail him. But Kelly helped with that again. A couple days later, she brought in her smartphone footage. The footage showed the head doctor and the driver dragging boxes out of the warehouse under the cover of night. Of course, the camera on the old smartphone wasn't great. But even this quality was enough to make the image quite distinguishable. And the people were easy to identify. That same morning, Emily summoned the couple to her office. Here's the thing, Ben, she began. You've been fired from your position as chief physician of my clinic and head of the plastic surgery department. Why should I be? The man was indignant. I will sue Try, but first you have to pay for all the damage you've done to the clinic over the years. We'll conduct a thorough audit of your activities together with an independent company, uncover all the schemes, including the write-off of usable medicines. And then we'll see where they'll take you with a list of transgressions like that. You don't want to ruin my career, shouted the chief physician. Aren't you taking on too much? Don't you get it yet, Ben? Emily asked tiredly. My career and reputation are already ruined. Nothing will ever be the same as it was before. And me, asked Tom. What about me and you'll leave as an accessory? Emily replied indifferently. Do you really think you can escape punishment? You'd be wrong. By the way, I'm severing our relationship too. You may be free in every way. But Emily, I wanted to secure our future together and save up for our wedding, the ex-fiancé yelled. And I already have a great plan, Emily smiled. Get out of here. Otherwise we'll have to call security. The breakup had hurt her ego. But the hardships of the last month at the clinic had already tempered Emily's character quite well. She went about her usual routine. For the position of chief physician called already retired friend of his father, Uncle Michael. He agreed to help her out by closing the vacancy that had suddenly opened up. Emily breathed a sigh of relief. She went around showing her father's friend his new property. And then Debra reported a visitor waiting outside her office, and there was Steve Norton, Adam's father. Hello. I think we're on the verge of being discharged, he smiled. Adam's feeling pretty good already. Might as well get some treatment at home. Too well. That's up to the doctor to decide. Talk to Kevin, Emily suggested. Adam's a free patient, and extra days in the ward won't cost you anything. That's not what I mean. Is it? Steve smiled. Just missing my son. He's the only one I've got left. Wife's dead. No other kids. Well, you'd avoid such dangerous games, then Emily reminded him. Yeah, I know, Steve answered himself. Listen, I heard a rumor that the old CT scanner at the clinic is malfunctioning. Yeah, there's that. Emily sighed. But you still haven't decided to buy one, have you? Do you have to sort out the costs first? I'm willing to donate it to you, Steve smiled. My company is in the business of supplying high-tech medical equipment. Wow, that would certainly be great, but we'll manage on our own, Emily replied. I've seen the prices on CT scanners. It's a lot of space. You saved my son's life. What's the score? Steve was indignant. Don't even argue. You'll have a CT scanner within a month. While Emily was dealing with an unexpected benefactor, the ex-fiancé was plotting revenge. He'd already made some acquaintances at the clinic. He'd even had an affair with one of the nurses, the one who treated Kelly the most. He was angry about the girl's affectionate friendship with the clinic owner and a new rich patient. Emily was very angry. In the evening, she called Tom and began to tell him the news. Can you believe this upstart managed to get a new CT scanner from a sponsor? It's being paid for by some rich daddy. But how come? Why does she always get lucky out of the blue? Tom was indignant. What's that? Our Kelly is quietly flirting with this rich son of a bitch, sitting there cooing like lovebirds. The paychecks are trickling in. We're the ones who have to work our asses off, and she just sits around the ward, Tom said unfairly and ended the conversation. A plan for revenge was brewing in his head. His brother worked for a local newspaper, an online publication. A reporter had asked him to write an article ostensibly in the interview genre. It told Adam's story on Emily's behalf without names, but with many humiliating details and sordid details. The heroine of the fake interview was identified as the owner of the clinic. Of course, this infuriated Steve Norton. He made a scandal, and then in his heart took back all his promises. The upset father wanted to take Adam home, but the boy resisted it himself. He bonded with Kelly, Kevin, and Emily and believed the heiress's version of the story that she was set up with the article. They believed it without reservation, and Emily herself remembered where Tom's brother worked. Except that wasn't an argument for Steve. You see, it's not the CAT scan that offends me, Emily told her friends that evening, sitting in Adam's room. It's just that it's so easy to lie to anyone, and they can't prove anything. It's really disgusting. The scribblers are really getting naked, Kevin said indignantly. I'd sue that publication. Yeah, I already got the lawyers up. They removed the information from the site. And what's printed on the paper has gone to the people. But Tom, too, if we can prove his involvement in this case, will have to answer for defamation. I'm just embarrassed for you, Emily smiled guiltily. Come on, it happens. I wasn't very smart myself with that bet with my dad, the boy laughed. You could say I get it deservedly so. Too bad you end up suffering too. Okay, I'm going to go now, guys. The auditors are coming tomorrow. We'll count the losses. It's already clear that this amount of money could have been used to buy more than one tomograph. I'm already terrified. Hang in there, Kevin put his arm around her shoulders. We're with you mentally. The damage assessment had indeed been tumultuous. It resulted in more than one police report. The former head doctor became a criminal case, and his accomplices included Tom, who had betrayed Emily. His mother even went to her son's ex-fiancé, crying, demanding to take back the statement, but Emily was adamant. She certainly had no pity for her wife. The same nurses who'd been harassing Kelly for years were also fired. They, too, had been involved in the doctor-in-chief's machinations. Emily ended up making Kevin the charge nurse on the ward. She had enough experience. Kelly had taken additional training to improve her skills and was now recruiting new staff on the ward herself. Adam had been discharged from the clinic, and he'd rented an apartment nearby where he'd put his mother. He took the girl under his wing. In public, they were extremely friendly. But Emily and Kevin knew the couple was already in a relationship. They had started dating themselves. Although Emily was slow to open up after Tom's betrayal, people were hard for her to trust. And while Emily was dealing with the problems of the clinic, her mother during the annual medical examination found a serious disease, a tumor requiring surgical intervention. At first, they thought she'd be fine without surgery. But the treatment wasn't working well. Sarah grew weaker. Watching her agony, Kevin advised take her to our clinic. We'll take a look at her, keep an eye on her. Can you operate on her yourself? Emily asked. I only trust your judgment. Well, I'm not an oncologist. It takes a specialist, Kevin stretched out doubtfully. And then I don't have much surgical experience. And there are medical ethics too. In fact, we try not to take family and friends for surgeries. Come on, what's so stupid, superstitious? Emily took umbrage. I trust you. Mom does too. That's enough to make up my mind. Oh, don't push it, please, Kevin begged. It's not that simple. I'd still like to examine her first, get the test results and stuff. Well, of course I trust you completely, Emily replied cheerfully to her lover. Whatever you say, that's what we'll do. But after 2 weeks, it became clear that they were just wasting time at the clinic. Kevin, who had agreed to this adventure under the influence of the moment, was increasingly having reasonable doubts about the need for treatment. His personal tests were getting worse. Oncologists insisted on surgery, while Emily and her mother acted like ostriches, pretending it was none of their business. Kevin came to Adam with his thoughts on the subject and unexpectedly found a support group. Well, if you're not sure about the outcome of the operation, then say no, his friend advised. Why are you freaking out? I've been snitched on. Do it yourself, do it yourself. And I'm not an oncologist. You need a specialist of a different level. Yeah, my mother had treatment, Adam confirmed. I even know that the best clinic for it is in our neighboring state. The doctors there literally work miracles. There's a professor. He extended my mom's life for 3 years. A real professional. You get me Sarah's labs, I'll send them to him to look at. Thank you, of course. But have you ever heard of doctor-patient confidentiality? Kevin said indignantly. Yeah, we've got a man on the verge of life and death here, Adam reminded him. Let's ask Emily. That same evening, they called the owner of the clinic. Emily was tired, talking sluggishly, not thinking straight. That's why she didn't take Adam's offer with enthusiasm at first. But he argued passionately, Emily, I know that in this disease, time is the most valuable resource. Let's show the professor the results. After all, it will cost you nothing. And in fact, I'm willing to pay for the operation too. It's expensive, but it's a real chance. Thank you all for the offer. But I think we've already decided everything. Mom had the surgery with Kevin's participation and stay out of it altogether. Okay, well, what's your problem? Adam resented. Just think about it. The oncologist at your clinic isn't the best. Kevin's a trauma specialist in general. Surgery is his secondary specialty, not his main one. What are you going to accomplish by being so stubborn? I mean, we're talking about a real person here. With what? Stop bullying. Well, just because you've had a bad experience doesn't mean others will. Emily, look, this isn't a game. Let me just send the tests. Well, please, okay, get the chart, the statement, whatever you need. Just tell me, I'll take care of it. Just don't argue with Kevin directly. I could barely get him to help me. He's hysterical. The level of responsibility. Like I'm not scared. Adam received and sent all the information to the very same professor. The verdict was unequivocal. Surgery was urgently needed. There could be no delay. Emily immediately lashed out at Kevin. She demanded that he set a date. Meanwhile, Sarah was getting worse. She couldn't get up anymore. She felt weak all the time. It was becoming clear that the surgery itself would also be questionable with her vitals. The morning before the operation, Kevin suddenly realized that he could do nothing. He was in a state of real terror. His hands were shaking and waves of panic came over him. Even while trying to shave, Kevin had made several cuts, and at the thought that his scalpel hand might shake, he immediately felt sick. He called Emily, who was already at the clinic, and was just as nervous. "Honey, I'm sorry, I think I have a cold. I can't operate today," he blurted out. "But you were still fine yesterday. Or did you just chicken out?" "Kevin, what's even going on?" "Well, yeah, I'm a coward. I can't do anything about it. Emily, I agreed to all this under your pressure. And now I realize the situation is delusional. Well, think about it. A surgeon with no experience. But what's it going to do to your mom?" "What am I supposed to do?" Emily said indignantly. "You're setting everyone up because of your own cowardice. That's not a manly thing to do at all." "It's better to be a coward than to lose a patient," Kevin answered her. "That's what I was taught. Emily, when my hands are shaking, I couldn't shave properly. Do you want the same thing to happen with the scalpel?" "No," Kevin, Emily replied quietly. "But what's there to do?" "I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm going to stay home tonight anyway." Emily hung up the phone and cried, realized that time was almost gone. Just then she got a call from Adam. "So, has the surgery started?" he asked. "I'll be there to support you." "It's not going to be anything," Emily sobbed into her voice. "Kevin's hands are shaking. He's backed out." "But it's for the best," Adam said confidently. "I'll check with the professor right now to see if he'll take your mom's surgery." An hour later, he arrived at the clinic in person. His face was solemn and joyful. "Anyway," the doctor said to take the patient away. "He will see her himself today and schedule the operation. Well, in the next few days for sure. And don't worry about the money. I've already paid for everything from the room to the rehab." "You're crazy," Emily cried again. "Well, how are we going to arrange transportation? Bogging down the roads. Mom won't be able to bear it. Besides, it's a pretty long way to the neighboring region." "Well, what can I tell you? Actually, I've ordered an air ambulance. It should arrive in a couple hours," Adam answered her. "Emily, let's sign off. We need to get ready, and you need to get yourself organized." "Wow. Well, yeah," she smiled weakly. "Looks like you're my hero today." Adam smiled. Together they had organized Sarah's preparations for transportation rather quickly and intelligently. She fell into oblivion now and then. There was really no time to delay. A couple hours later, the helicopter arrived. Only the patient and her daughter were taken on board. Adam got in the car and drove off. 4 hours later, he was already in the courtyard of the clinic where that famous professor worked. In the waiting room, he found Emily. She was sitting almost exhausted. It turned out that after the examination, Emily was immediately taken to the surgery, which was still going on. 15 minutes later, Ben the doctor came out to see them. He greeted Adam like an old acquaintance and said that the operation had been successful. Mom had been sent to the ward in a sterile post-op box for now, and future prognosis depended solely on her body. "Why did you take so long?" rebuked her doctor. "In such cases, the disease progresses rapidly." "But our oncologist said there was still time," Emily excused herself. "Besides, I don't take my mom by the hand to the doctors, so they found out too late." "Well, you should. You just have to take your elderly parents to the doctors," Ben replied. "They're not always ready to go themselves." Emily nodded. She felt a huge sense of relief that the surgery was behind her. She and Adam headed to the coffee machine, then drove over and got a room for her at a nearby hotel. It was decided that Emily would stay in this town for at least a week. Adam promised her that he would keep her work at the clinic under his supervision. In the evening, Kevin called. "Do you hate me now?" he asked. "I'm a wimp and a wimp. That's what I am." "Oh, come on. Our oncologists overlooked a lot of things too. It doesn't matter now. Mom's out of surgery, She's even recovered from the anesthesia. What's going to happen to us next? Kevin asked. Will the relationship continue or what? Let's take a break for now, Emily suggested. I don't have time for lovemaking and fighting anyway. I need to get my mom back on her feet. That's the most important thing. Everything else comes later. You're dumping me, Kevin declared. Or maybe the surgery is just an excuse. Have you even wanted to break up for a long time? Are you delusional? Emily asked. That's it. Sorry. I don't have time. My mom's calling. She hung up the phone and Kevin went to get on night duty. There weren't many patients on the ward. He went over the histories, the appointments. Then he called Nurse Kelly into his office. They went over the current appointments. Afterward, Kevin offered to have coffee with her, and in between, he told her about his spat. Kevin, you realize she's not a medical professional, so she sees things differently, Kelly explained to him. To me, your frustration is completely understandable and obvious. After all, the main principle of treatment is to do no harm. And to her, such doubts look like cowardice. What am I saying? You really understood me right away. And Emily's got some unexplainable problems, Kevin rejoiced. And anyway, it's probably right that we're splitting up. Apparently, doctors need to find their own kind to marry. Right. Who else are you going to tell what happened in the operating room? Kelly laughed. By the way, Tom and I only have a friendship now, too. It didn't work out. Instead of romance, it was discussing you and Emily all the time. I think he's secretly in love with her in general. Jealous? Or don't care? Kevin smiled. No, of course not. If they're going to be happy, let them be. Kelly smiled too. Okay. I'm going to go run your errands. Evening shots and medications are coming up soon, no time to talk. Kevin grinned at her and didn't understand how he had been able to ignore the simple truths for so long. Kelly was much closer to him than Emily. And now the breakup seemed like a blessing in disguise. Meanwhile, Emily spent hours at her mother's bedside. She was on the mend, but she still needed comprehensive treatment. Adam had paid for it at once, so Emily had no additional expenses. He came almost every day. A couple of times even in the company of her father. Steve's visits had a special effect on Sarah. On such days, she demanded her daughter's best lace shirt and robe. She painted her lips and her eyes took on a special glow. With Emily, too, Steve had settled things, finally listening to Adam's arguments that she would never agree to do such an interview. Mom, do you like Tom? Emily's mother once asked, gathering her for a walk. Great guy. Not like your ex, Sarah replied. By the way, his father is pretty great too. Yeah, we see you two making eyes at each other, Emily smiled. Who knew you were such a flirt? I've got Steve calling me in the evenings now. Yesterday he was at the opera with his partners, videotaping Ada. I'm sitting here listening to it like I've been there myself. In fact, he promised we'd go. I just need to get well soon. There are so many interesting things around and I miss everything. So you're having an affair, Emily gasped, right under the kids' noses. And we don't suspect a thing. You'd better keep up too, her mother chastised her. Because I don't think I'm going to have any grandchildren. It's time to get married. If you don't figure it out for yourself, I'll hint it to Adam. I'll have to take it into my own hands. Well, no, we'll do it ourselves, the daughter replied. That evening, she and Adam marveled at their blindness. He, of course, had noticed that Dad had changed, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. And it turned out that Steve had taken a fancy to Emily Mommy. Now we have to get ahead of them, Emily said. Get married first, Adam laughed. Otherwise you'll be related to me. And in that case, it's kind of not very pretty to get married anymore. I propose. I accept, laughed Emily. Where's the ring? Adam twisted something that looked like a circle out of the grass stalks. This one for now. The real one will be too. Give me some time to think about it. Because I'm a fickle girl. I'll be in the hospital a little longer and I'll marry Professor Komutov for sure. When Sarah was discharged, everyone returned to their hometown. Things at the clinic, thanks to the new head doctor, were going fine, almost without requiring Emily's intervention. Mom moved almost immediately from her and her daughter's modest apartment to Steve's multi-room country house. Adam and Emily settled into the apartment they had inherited from their father and began preparing for the wedding. Upon hearing about it, Kevin and Kelly suggested that they have a couple's ceremony. Everyone was thrilled with the idea. The women immediately began to make plans for the organization of the event, the place, the decor, to look at styles of wedding dresses. Kevin and Adam just laughed. But they did not argue with their lovers and agreed to the appointed day. Both couples signed in the registry office and then married. To the altar, Emily was led by Adam's father. On the holiday walked almost all the employees of the clinic, and those who stayed on duty were sent a piece of wedding cake in beautiful boxes. Looking at her happy daughter, Sarah herself was ready to take another risk and get married. And when she caught one of the bride's bouquets, everyone laughed with relief. Now it was safe to blame the coming marriage on a well-known man. But not only fun accompanied Emily's everyday life. She was getting deeper and deeper into the life of the clinic, and even went to get additional management training. She was sure to need it in business. Kelly also enrolled in medical school. At her husband's urging, she wanted to become a pediatrician. The former head doctor of the clinic and his accomplices were put on trial. The man received the maximum penalty for his embezzlement. Ben's theft was too brazen. He begged for reconciliation, but Emily was adamant. This man, who almost ruined her father's business, hardly deserved leniency. Tom, on the other hand, got a lesser sentence in juvie, and vice versa, showered Emily with curses, blaming her for his failures. And after learning that the former lover is already married, and in general, as if off the chain snapped, but his hysterics, no one was no longer interested. After all, young families were waiting for a new addition. Mike sat on the bleachers of a large gymnasium and watched with admiration his 17-year-old daughter, Darla, who at that moment showed wonders of flexibility and artistry on a makeshift arena made of mats. The girl lightly made a long silk ribbon obediently curl around her slender legs, and then made a sharp turn, threw the handle from the ribbon in the air and deftly catch it when her body gracefully rotated around its own axis. The hall was immediately deafened by applause, and a happy smile broke out on Darla's face. Waving goodbye to the audience, the young girl left the mat and her performance ended. "Dad, what do you think?" Darla asked her father with excitement in her voice as she tightened the laces of her light-colored sneakers. "What can I say? You're a professional, honey. A real fairy on stage," Mike said, smiling. "If I hadn't seen you plow 10 hours in the gym, I would never have thought that all those fluttering with ribbons. It's such a hell of a lot of hard work." "Oh, come on." The girl shrugged. "Standard workouts. I don't have anything special. The Olympic champions are the ones who work with such dedication that I never dreamed of in my worst nightmares. Can you imagine that they sometimes sleep only 4-0 a day and then go straight to training? And this is a flutter compared to them. So, a mere amateur." Darla shook her head, and her father gently stroked his daughter's arm instead of saying anything else. He knew very well how important rhythmic gymnastics was to him, and how much time and effort his girl devoted to this beautiful but incredibly hard activity. "You're always downplaying your efforts and your talent," Mike said softly. "You remind me a lot of my mom. She, too, doubted herself every time it came to putting her paintings up for sale in galleries. Always afraid of large-scale exhibitions." Darla looked at him with slight sadness. "If you only knew how much I miss her, Dad," she said wistfully, adjusting the antique silver bracelet on her arm, the only memory of her mother Elena that she had left after her death. Her father had once given his fiancée this lovely bauble as a token of his love, and she had never taken it off since. When her daughter turned 12, Mike gave her the bracelet. Alana and the girl, just like her mom, wore it on her right hand all the time. "Honey, you performed just fine. Mommy would be proud of you." "Believe me," her father assured her. After all, it's still just a preliminary screening. You have plenty of time to hone the elements you're not completely sure of. Darla looked at her father with genuine gratitude and love. You know, I'm incredibly lucky to have a father. You're the best daddy ever. The girl put her arms around her father's neck and lightly pecked his cheek. Are you going to go to work again now? Yeah. Mike stretched out with a sigh. What do I do if my managers can't close a single deal without me? Father and daughter look at each other understandingly and then laugh amicably. Both of them knew perfectly well that no managers had anything to do with it. It was just that Mike, being a successful businessman, liked to plan everything on his own and make deals. That's why he often stayed in his office until the middle of the night or traveled for weeks at a time. The businessman did not trust his business to anyone, even his most trusted people, and preferred to keep control over everything that happened inside his company. The same kind of humor helped him further diffuse the situation at times when his daughter would have loved to spend a couple more hours with her father. Darla realized, however, that this was sadly not possible. Okay, thank you for coming to the checkup today, she said to Mike. It meant a lot to me, really. Daughter, remember one thing, you will always be my priority, no matter what happens, always. The businessman repeated again. After that, the two of them got into his luxury car and drove to Mike's country mansion. After dropping Darla home and saying goodbye to her, the businessman went straight to his office. He had an important case scheduled for today, and he really hoped that luck would favor him this time. The partners from France, with whom the businessman had long dreamed of concluding a contract, finally paid attention to the success of his firm. Now, Mike very much expected to conclude with them a very favorable deal for himself. While he and the driver were driving, the man involuntarily plunged into his own memories. Few people, looking at this another man of 45 years old, would think that he was born and raised in the most ordinary family. However, that is exactly what happened. Mike's parents worked at the same factory, his father as a welder in the hot shop, and his mother as a cook in the factory cafeteria. It was not easy for young Mike to work his way up through his own social environment. The guy dreamed of big money and serious business practically from childhood. He did not fit in with the ideals of the so-called working youth of those years. Someone considered him an upstart, and someone directly called him a loser and warned that the desire for more will only come to him in a bad way. And Mike shouldn't get involved with anything more complicated than construction tools or blueprints and a dial. However, young Mike did not consider it shameful to be an upstart among his peers and went steadily towards his goal of stratification of business. At home, Mike was not very supportive either. But his father, unlike his mother, who was terribly worried about the future of her not moderately ambitious son, at least believed that the boy can still do something. You shouldn't be so worried about him, Catherine, said John, Mike's father. He's a smart kid who studies all day long. He'll be a good kid in the big city. So now he has to spend the rest of his life at the factory with us, mowing his health for nothing. Catherine only shook her head and wept. John, dear, look at him. What kind of businessman is our son? It is so not serious. He's so puny, so weak. He even got a certificate of exemption for physical education. They'll torture him there, and that's all. Still, Mike was absolutely sure that what he had planned would work out, and therefore he was intensively preparing to enter the Faculty of Economics all summer after graduation. The hard work and desire of the guy was eventually rewarded. Having entered the budgetary place in the university, Mike immediately moved to New York, where he was even allocated a room in the student dormitory. The mother of the guy to the last did not believe that her poor boy leaves to conquer the big city. However, her spouse explained to her that such a smart and talented guy, as their son was, just did not understand. Catherine, John tried to reason with her. He has absolutely no future here, unlike in the big city, where he can put all his calculating skills into practice. Catherine still cried as she did so, but eventually resigned herself to it. She sincerely wanted her son to succeed, and he would find his happiness in a noisy and bright metropolis. Over the next 5 years, Mike pleased his parents and his teachers with success in his studies. The guy was considered one of the best students in his course at the university, passing each session only for excellent grades. Mike's father was very proud, and his mother began to realize that her husband was right. They were already making grandiose plans for their son's future when a terrible tragedy happened in their lives. Both spouses died in a terrible fire that occurred on their property. The fault of drunken neighbors. They had a party in their house and did not watch the stove. and at night the fire broke out with terrible force and immediately spread to the roof of John's bathhouse, which stood right next to the neighbor's house, separated from it only by an old fence. When Mike's father woke up and rushed to put out the fire, it was too late. The bathhouse was almost burned to the ground, and the flames were starting to reach Catherine and John's house, trying to knock down the fire. The couple used up all the water that was on their property and wanted to give up this thankless task, especially since the fire department was in no hurry to come to their remote village. The husband and wife tried to take out of the fire all the most valuable money and documents for the house accumulated over many years of hard work. At that moment, a heavy floor beam collapsed on them with a terrible rumble. The police, who then arrived at the scene of the tragedy together with specialists, stated that it was an accident. Mike's parents died almost instantly, and there was no one to blame for their deaths. Mike, who was then in his final year of university, learned about the death of his parents and went into severe shock. He could not eat for several days, and during the funeral and the wake that followed, he could not utter a single word, grief tearing at his broken heart. And the young man wanted nothing and expected nothing more from his life. The death of his nearest and dearest people seemed to finally undermine him, destroying all the joy and purposefulness on which he only lived all the last years. A week after all that happened, Mike discovered the first gray hair on his temples. At that moment, he finally realized that his youth had come to an end and that now he was an adult. After returning to the city, the first thing the young man did was to sell his parents' property. He did not want to return to the village ever again. Too many difficult events had happened there, and Mike wanted to close the door to that part of his past forever. To settle the land, the future businessman delved back into his studies, trying to ignore the pity in the eyes of his classmates. Now, the main goal of the young man was to finish the university with a red diploma. So he wanted to honor the memory of his mother and father and prove to himself that he could still achieve his goal. Otherwise, all this and study and his move to the big city was for nothing. The only person who supported him all this time was his girlfriend, Alana. She studied at the same course as Mike, only she chose the Faculty of Art History. The young student was crazy about painting and architecture and even drew very well herself, but she never believed in her own strength enough to switch from the study of art to its direct creation. Alana admired the endurance and perseverance of Mike, so when he almost broke the story of the death of his relatives, the girl did everything possible so that her beloved did not feel lonely. It was then that Mike himself first thought about how strong his feelings for Alana. Realizing that only she alone was for him all this terrible time support, Mike decided and made his beloved a proposal. "Will you marry me?" Mike asked in the courtyard of the Philharmonic after they left the concert early. They both found the concert terribly boring. To make his words sound more solemn, the guy got down on one knee in front of his beloved and handed her a small open heart-shaped box covered with red velvet. Inside, on a snow-white silk pad, lay a gold engagement ring with a tiny, but sparkling like a star diamond. "Oh my God." "Mike," she gasped delightedly. "How lovely." Mike looked at her expectantly and with some tension in his gaze. Elena forgot herself for a moment, slightly bewildered by the unexpectedness of the situation, but then exclaimed happily, "Yes." "Well, of course, I agree. My love." The lad was greatly relieved. Just in a burst of feelings, she spun in a light dance, after which he tenderly kissed his bride. After the wedding, life flashed new colors for Mike. The first thing he had to do was to find a job that would allow them to rent a good apartment and continue the cultural lifestyle to which they had become so accustomed during their time as students. So, having collected his documents and diplomas, the guy went to interview in all decent firms, where they were ready to consider his candidacy for a place as an economist or financial analyst. After the third interview, he was accepted in a promising young firm, which was engaged in the supply of building materials throughout the country. And it was in this company that the man subsequently worked until the very moment he was asked to head it. Alana also did not intend to sit on her young husband's neck, and therefore quite quickly found a place as a staff guide in one of the capital's museums. Yes, it was not as prestigious as the work of a real art historian, but it was certainly better than running on all fumes waitress in some cheap eatery, while your diploma is dusty on the shelf and does not bring any benefit to society. Young people worked hard and then could disappear all day long somewhere in the theater or at fashion exhibitions. For some time the couple lived, as they call it, for themselves, enjoying feelings in each other's company. This was not very much like the parents of Alana herself, who constantly pressured their daughter with requests to give birth to to their grandchildren. However, the girl was resolute in her intention to get on her feet first, and then already engaged in expanding her own family. "I don't like these progressive views of yours, daughter." Every time Elena's mother came to visit her daughter and son-in-law, "We're doing quite a lot of things with our father, aren't we? When do you want us to take care of your little ones?" "Mama, you don't have to get along with anyone," she smiled. "Not now, not later. Mike and I are grown, independent adults and are quite capable of raising our children on our own. If we need your help, it will certainly be rare. Don't worry." Alana's mother pressed her lips together and looked at her daughter sadly. No way had she thought she would be faced with her own daughter's reluctance to have children in her old age. If they were adults, they would have babysat long ago. Or instead of going on and on about culture, how much more can we do? Ashley, though a native city dweller, was a member of the so-called old-school crowd. She didn't understand why her daughter and her husband didn't live like the normal daughters of her friends. Why don't they give birth to fat, flexible babies whose laughter would drown out the expanse of their large one-bedroom apartment from morning to night? "You seem to have completely forgotten what a woman's true mission is, don't you?" her mother asked Alana, looking at her reproachfully. Don't start, please," Alana begged her, "so I'll remind you." "I don't mind," Ashley continued as if not noticing her objection. "A woman's mission is to give birth and nurture and pass on all her experience and love to the next generation." Alana clutched her ears with her hands each time to keep from hearing the same thing. Alana's mother had worked as a middle school teacher all her life and had given birth to Alana herself very late by the standards of her friends when she was already over 30. However, as soon as she started such a conversation with her daughter, it would immediately appear that she had good reasons for it, which you see Alana herself lacked. "I promise you, when we decide to have a baby, you and Dad will be the first to know," Ashley replied tiredly. Her daughter was unable to go against her stubbornness. "But how long do I have to wait for you?" the woman said, and then abruptly turned the conversation to some other topic. Mike and Elena spent several more years childless before they felt ready to have a son or daughter, and I was 28 years old at the time. But despite some concerns from doctors about her age, the woman was successful with their future daughter for most of her term. Of course, at first she, just like all pregnant women, was tormented by a little toxicosis and swelling in the first trimester, but all this passed quite quickly, and then Alana felt just fine. By that time, Mike had become a successful top manager in his firm, and the general director warned him that he saw him as his future successor. He said that only such a person as Mike would be able to provide his company with a decent development after he went on a well-deserved vacation. Mike then took the words of his boss with all responsibility and was ready to work 2 or 3 times as much if the company's business required it. At the same time, he was not going to miss the birth of his wife, about which he warned management. The director reacted surprisingly calmly, to such an extent he trusted his best employee, so he gave Mike something like a mini maternity leave during the— Elena was already choosing a name for the baby when the news of Ashley's death suddenly broke. Mike received a call that day from Alana's father, who told him that his wife had had a heart attack during the night. Mike was devastated by the news and for a while didn't know the best way to tell Alana. He was very worried that such a shock could adversely affect the condition of the child, so at first he even thought not to tell his wife anything before the birth so that she did not worry. However, nothing came out of this idea, as Elena very quickly realized from his face that "You're hiding something from me. I can see it," she said to Micah as she lay in the labor room, stroking her large rounded belly. "Realize by not telling me anything, you're only making it worse." Her husband looked at his beloved wife, and in his eyes, Alana saw regret and pain. "What's wrong?" the pregnant woman asked him again, more insistently. "Or something with my parents." "Don't be silent. Tell me." Mike sucked in more air into his chest before slowly speaking. "Dear Alana, you just don't worry. Your mom?" What is it?" she said, pale, even though she had already realized that she was in trouble. "She's no longer with us," Mike said quietly, lowering his head. For the next few moments, Alana sat silent and unmoving. The man began to worry if she had gone into shock, when her spouse suddenly exclaimed several times, and with the words, "Mommy, mommy, honey, why did you leave?" She burst into tears at the top of her voice. Mike tried to calm her down as best he could, but quickly noticed that his wife's sobs had at some point turned into painful screams. So he called for a nurse, and the nurse, after a cursory examination of Alana and probing her abdomen, stated that she was in labor. "Oh God, it hurts." Alana cried out once again as she was wheeled on a gurney to the delivery room. Mike had been there the whole time, saying something encouraging to his wife. Though now, after so many years, he couldn't remember exactly what it was. He wasn't allowed to go to the operation. So Mike was forced to spend the next few hours in the corridor, sitting on a hard, uncomfortable chair and listening to the incessant cries of his wife from behind the door. The businessman remembered that at some point his nerves got the best of him and he simply passed out. He came to his senses only after the doctor who delivered Alana shook him violently by the shoulder. "Mike, you're not feeling well, wake up, please." The man struggled but regained consciousness and began rubbing his face with his palms to quickly regain wakefulness. When he looked up at the doctor, he immediately realized something was wrong. His face was as white as chalk. The hand that had just awakened him was cold as ice and somehow lifeless. "How is my wife? How is Alana? Is she feeling well?" The first thing the businessman asked the doctor and nurse quickly glanced at each other. The doctor then informed Mike, "I'm sorry, Mike. We did everything we could for your spouse, but the bleeding was too much. Plus, the baby girl was very large. In coming out, she hit a vital artery in Alana's body. She didn't stand a chance." Again, my condolences. Mike felt his chin shake finally with horror then. Salty tears sprang from his eyes of their own accord. "No," he whispered, and shook his head negatively. "No, it can't be. She couldn't die, she couldn't." He said, "Take Mike to the spare room and sedate him." The doctor commanded the nurse. "We don't want him throwing a tantrum in here." The man himself did not remember how he had found himself in the ward, lying on the hard bed and staring at the ceiling at a single point next to the old chandelier. It was only now beginning to dawn on him that he had lost her. Lost is Alana, the only woman he felt truly alive and happy with. They'd been married for almost 8 years. 8. He couldn't even believe it then. It seemed to him that they hadn't been married more than a week or two, and now she was gone. God, he roared like a wounded animal. For what? All that was left in his chest. All remnants of his soul seemed to have been scorched to the ground. The pain of loss was so intense that he felt it physically, right where his tortured heart was located. It wasn't until later that he remembered that he had a child. "A girl, my daughter? What's wrong with her?" Mike asked, silence surrounding him. Jumping out of bed, the man rushed to the doctor's office and asked the surgeon, who delivered his wife, the same question. "Calm down, please sit down." The doctor pointed him to a chair. When Mike reluctantly complied, the woman continued, "Your daughter is fine. She's in a postpartum pod right now. That's perfectly normal for her situation." The businessman looked at her as if his future depended on her words. Considering her mother is dead, subsequent nutrition for the baby will have to be done solely by artificial feeding. So I suggest you look into the matter as soon as possible. The doctor looked at Mike a little sternly, but when she saw that he was genuinely worried about the fate of his child and at the same time experiencing the tragic death of his wife, she softened considerably. "Look, I understand what you're going through, honestly, but you are not the first and, unfortunately, not the last man whose wife dies during childbirth. It happens, and there's nothing you can do about it." The doctor leaned closer to the businessman and continued, "The only thing you need to think about right now, the only thing you need to focus on as much as possible, is your little girl in the newborn box. So be a role model for her. Be strong, confident in your own success. Believe me, children read all this no worse than adults. In addition, it will help you get closer, which for a child who lost his mother in the first few hours of life is incredibly important." Mike nodded slowly then and swallowed with difficulty the huge acidic lump in his throat. If all of what the doctor was saying was true, then he would be the best father in the world to his daughter. When he was allowed to pick up his daughter, Mike almost cried when he saw the tiny baby girl in the pink warm envelope. That same day, he gave the girl the name Darla, which in translation from Greek means winner. For the next 17 years, the businessman did everything possible for his daughter so that she never for a minute did not stop feeling his love and support. Although at first it was very difficult for the single father, but he still managed to survive this difficult period. Despite being constantly busy, Mike still tried to be there for his child whenever possible. Darla never spent a single birthday or New Year's Eve alone or surrounded by only babysitters and daycare children. So when a daughter at the age of 4 became seriously interested in rhythmic gymnastics, the father only marveled at the willpower and stamina of his nondescript Darla. The girl's grandfather, John, in the early years of great help to his son-in-law, took the little girl to the section and later into competitions. Darla adored her grandfather and considered him her second best friend on earth after her father. Unfortunately, John was already quite old at that time and, like his late wife, had heart problems. When the granddaughter turned 9 years old, her grandfather passed away. The cause of the man's death was a massive stroke, which immediately gave a fatal complication to his heart. Darla cried very long and hard at the time. She could not imagine life without her beloved grandfather. So Mike was forced to take an unscheduled vacation at his firm for an indefinite period of time. For the next 2 weeks, he never left his daughter's side, constantly improving and distracting her until the little child's grief gradually subsided. In time, Darla returned to her usual routine and constant training, and this was the salvation that helped her to finally calm down and become stronger and more solid in spirit. "I will dedicate every victory I win to my grandfather," Darla promised her father. "I believe both he and Mom and Grandma are all watching over me from heaven and would really like to see me succeed in sports." "Of course, dear," the businessman smiled fondly, stroking his daughter through her soft, light brown hair. "You know, you're an incredibly wise girl. I'm really glad you were able to let go of Grandpa and continue to enjoy life." "I love you, Daddy." Shortly, Darla answered him and hugged her father tightly around the neck. "Mike, are you okay? Can you hear me?" announced the businessman and his driver when they were already approaching the office, thus bringing the man out of his reverie. "Why?" "Yes, of course, Nicholas. You were saying something. I couldn't get back to reality right away." Nicholas's driver looked at him carefully in the rearview mirror but said nothing. He had often noticed how his boss was immersed in his thoughts while on the road, and so he was used to it by now. "Yes, I'm telling you. Human Resources just called and said they were able to find you a new receptionist," Nicholas said, and at the same time carefully parked the owner's car. "They want you to take a look at her. They say she's a very competent lady. She knows what she's doing. She even seemed to have worked for your competitors some time ago, but left them because she wasn't satisfied with her salary." "Oh yeah," Mike chuckled. "All right, well, let's see who this lady is. I hope she at least knows how to make good coffee." A quarter of an hour later, he was already receiving in his office a tall, long-legged beauty of about 30 years old, giving him her graceful thin hand. As a sign of welcome, the woman introduced herself as Vivi and told the businessman about her extensive experience in secretarial work. Lexon, so the company director, noted to himself with satisfaction that the recruiters had not lied to him. This sultry brunette with plump lips and a thin waist really held her dignity and could present herself as if she were a real professional, and her gorgeous appearance was just the cherry on the cake, fitting the requirements of a reputable company like they were. "I think we're working with you, Vivi. Congratulations. You've been hired by us. Of course, you will have to go through a probationary period first, but I don't think you should have a problem with that." Vivi gave him a charming, special smile, then flicked a strand of her dark, bitter coffee-colored hair over her shoulder in elegant motion. "Thank you, Mike. I'm sure I'll enjoy working for your company, too. I can just feel the positive energy hanging around here." The woman lifted herself easily from the chair, and at that moment, the businessman saw a small, but rather racy part of her tanned cleavage. Vivi smiled again, while Mike involuntarily threw himself into a fever, and for a few moments, he even found it difficult to breathe. Since the death of his beloved wife, Alana, the businessman never remarried. Moreover, he hadn't been able to find a worthy companion with whom he could spend his time carefree, and who could open his soul as easily as he had with his wife. Oh, and he was just as worried about Darla. How would the girl feel about having another woman in his life? Would she get along with a hypothetical stepmother? Or would the relationship between them be in constant tension? All these fears tormented Mike and did not give him the opportunity to really relax in the company of a nice woman. Later, he gave up these thoughts, referring to his age and constant business busyness. "Mole, who will marry me so busy?" And here before him stood this stunning Vivi, whose smile could drive any sensible man crazy at the snap of a finger. The businessman's heart beat faster as he imagined that he could marry such a beautiful person. However, Mike hurriedly put such thoughts out of his mind. He did not want to become a bad illustration of the famous joke about the boss and his faithful secretary mistress. Gathering all his self-control in a fist, Mike politely said goodbye to the young woman, and she sent him a promising smile in return, then quietly replied, "I'll look forward to my first day on the job." "Good day, Mike," she said, and as gracefully as she had entered, she slipped through the open door of his office. The businessman leaned back in his chair with relief and took a few deep breaths and exhaled. Such a turnaround he certainly hadn't expected even from himself. Could it be that for the first time in all these years, a real hot feeling flared up in his soul, that this was the very fall of love, which so many famous poets had sung in their verses so many times? Be that as it may, we must first take a closer look at this Vivi. Mike thought to himself, it's not worth it at my age to jump into the deep end. We should wait a while. Having decided everything for himself, the man returned to work with difficulty and spent the rest of the day filling out another final report. However, no matter how hard he tried, he could not get out of his mind the beautiful secretary with whom he now had to work side by side. What an old fool, Mike scolded himself. God forbid you should fall in love in your old age. What are you going to do with all these feelings? The man shook his head and reproached himself for his heartlessness. At the same time, Vivi, with a satisfied smile on her face, was leaving the building and getting into a cab at the cab driver's call. The woman leaned against the car window and thought happily to herself, "Got it? You got me hooked? My good man. Now I'll get it all out of you. It's a sin to miss such a big fish. It's time for me to get my rightful piece of happiness with a millionaire. I'm just going to finish this one thing first, and then I'll get right on you, Mike." "Turn it up," she asked the driver, and he turned the radio knob. The salon was filled with some pop tune in which the singer was happily bragging to the listeners about her wealth and happiness, which consisted in private planes, diamonds, and rich idiots. In fact, Vivi was not too fond of music, but this song reflected her gambling moods right now. A couple weeks afterward, Mike's life was abruptly divided into before and after. The businessman dropped his daughter off at practice as usual and went to the office himself. Darla, being a recent graduate, decided to finally connect her life with rhythmic gymnastics. That's why she wanted to first perform at regional competitions and then start preparing to enter the Institute of Physical Education. Nothing that day did not foreshadow the terrible disaster, which in the very near future was to break into Mike's life. Like an eerie storm, he was working in his office as usual when suddenly his cell phone rang, screen up to his face. The man was surprised to see that it was his daughter calling. Strange, the businessman thought to himself. Darla never calls during practice, and that something was up. Feeling a slight uneasiness in his soul, Mike answered the phone. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Hello? Hello, Mike?" An unfamiliar female voice asked him. "Yes," the man replied in a shaky voice. "And why are you calling from my daughter's cell phone? Who are you?" There was a second pause on the other end of the line, and then the same voice spoke. "My name is Tina. I'm your daughter Darla's coach. Your little girl just fainted right during practice. I don't know what happened to her, but an ambulance is taking her away right now. You better come to the hospital." I dictated the address. Mike felt the ground go out from under his feet, everything going dramatically dark in his eyes, barely able to keep from passing out himself. He wrote down the address of the hospital, and after drinking a large glass of water with a sedative tablet, he drove. When he explained at the emergency room who he was and who he had come to see, he was immediately taken to the doctor who had been dealing with Darla's condition since being admitted to them. As he looked at the doctor, the businessman noted with annoyance that the expression on his face was very worried. "Explain to me what's wrong with my Darla," Mike asked him as they entered his office. The doctor hesitated, a little unsure how to begin. Then he asked with a sigh, "Tell me, have you ever noticed any suspicious symptoms in your daughter? Sudden bruises, weakness, elevated body temperature for no particular reason?" The businessman shook his head confusedly. "No, never. I have a daughter who's an athlete. Of course she often gets bruises. But none of the things you just mentioned anyway. Darla has never complained about anything. You see, I work a lot, though I try to be home more often, but it's not always possible." The doctor twirled the pen in his hands thoughtfully before answering. "I see. In that case, I have some bad news for you." Mike tensed all tense, unable to even contemplate what the doctor was going to tell him. "For God, what's wrong with my daughter?" he asked quietly. "It's suspected that Daria has acute leukemia. An examination has shown that she has monstrously excessive levels of certain enzymes responsible for blood clotting. Unfortunately, such a disease can appear in a person at almost any age. And teenagers who are actively engaged in physical activity are, alas, also at risk." Blake lowered his eyes, unable to look at the doctor. It had not yet fully dawned on him that his daughter was in mortal danger. Glancing down at his lap, the businessman was surprised to note how his hands were shaking with a fine tremor. It seemed to the man that he was in some terrible nightmare dream from which there was only one single way out to wake up. Tell me, is there anything I can do to help her?" The businessman asked the doctor in a drooping voice. His own voice seemed as if it were a stranger to him, as if he saw and heard himself from the outside, as if in a movie. The doctor looked at him carefully and answered with a sigh. "Yes, but we don't have much time. We'll still do further examination. So for now, the girl will remain under our care. You can have your blood tested. If you get a complete match, then we can perform a bone marrow transplant from you to your daughter. It's the only way to completely beat the disease." A tiny light of hope flashed in the businessman's eyes at the doctor's words. "Of course, doctor, I'm willing to do anything, even give up my whole self for parts, just to make my little girl well." "Good," he nodded. "Come along then. You need to be prepped." Mike stopped the doctor here, touching his arm lightly. "Excuse me, but can I see Darla? I need to talk to my daughter, explain things to her. I mean, she must be in such a state of terror right now." The doctor's voice sounded soft as he replied, "Don't worry. She already knows everything. Your girl is a real fighter. She took the news so calmly." The doctor looked at the businessman with slight envy. "You know, if I had a daughter like that, I would be incredibly proud of her. Such resilience and will." Mike nodded absent-mindedly. "Yes, I have her like that. You're not the first person to say those words to me." A few hours later, when all the necessary tests had been run, the doctor left the office, looking glumly at the results. From the look on his face, the businessman realized that the doctor was very unhappy about something. "Doctor, how can I be a donor for Darla?" The doctor slowly tore his gaze away from the papers. His eyes were full of regret and sadness. "To my great regret, Mike, you are not a match." The world at that moment instantly lost all of its colors in the businessman's eyes. Mike felt his hands sharply pricked, and therefore slowly sat down on the edge of the chair standing in the hall. Why? He could only ask. "It happens often," the doctor answered as calmly as possible. "Don't get upset before the time. You just need a closer relative with similar genetic material. Tell me, does your daughter have any siblings? Maybe the girl's mother could try donating her blood too." The depressed millionaire could hardly answer. "Her mother died years ago in childbirth. I am the only one she has left. Darla has no brothers or sisters." The doctor pressed his lips together and took a seat next to the businessman. "Then you have only one option left: to urgently find a donor. I will, of course, send a request through my channels, but the chance of finding one so quickly is slim. Try to find any other relatives of Darla's, preferably on her mother's side. Even the most distant relative might happen to have a phenotype that matches ours." Mike listened to the doctor while his head was a complete fog. Finally, turning to the doctor, he looked at him with eyes full of mute pleading. "Can I still see Darla? Please." "Sure. Let's go." The doctor responded instantly and led the man to the private room where his daughter had been transferred at Mike's request after her initial examination and all the necessary care. "Daddy," Darla exclaimed, and her father rushed to her, clutching his daughter tightly in his arms. "Darla, honey, how are you?" he asked the businessman. Tears were already glistening in his eyes. Darla looked very pale, but she was still holding up well. When she spoke, her voice sounded almost cheerful. Normal, considering what happened to me. "Dad, how is this possible? Why did this disease..." There was no fear in Darla's eyes, yet a huge question shone in them. And also a sense of injustice. "What about my competitions, my training?" The girl tried to talk about the most everyday things, obviously trying to push away the worst thoughts that way. Mike smiled at his daughter through her tears and stroked her face as gently as if she were made of crystal. "I'm afraid we'll have to say goodbye to that for a while," he said slowly. "The most important thing now is your health." After a moment's silence, the businessman decided to be honest with his daughter. "Darla, unfortunately, I won't be able to be your donor. My blood is not suitable for you, but I will definitely solve this issue. I'll find a donor, I promise you." Upon learning that her last hope had dissipated like smoke, Darla couldn't hold back her own tears. "How many dads?" "What? How many dads?" He didn't understand. "How much do the doctors give me?" The man sighed heavily, and because of that sigh, the girl realized that she didn't have long to live. "I see," Darla slowly muttered. "It turns out that this may be our last meeting." The girl looked at this so piercingly that the businessman's heart clenched. "No, of course not," Mike tried to reassure her. "I'll be sure to come to you again. I'll just try to find someone whose blood is exactly right for you first. I'll save you, daughter, I swear." Darla slowly stroked her father's cheek, saying, "Promise me you won't give up, even if I'm not in your life. You absolutely must live and remember me." Then I will be at peace up there." The girl raised her eyes to the ceiling, referring to the sky where her mother, grandfather, and grandmother resided. "Don't tell me such things," exclaimed Mike in despair. "You will live. Do you hear me? You're going to live." Mike began to cover Darla's hand with kisses, then assured her that he would come visit her in a few days. His daughter gave her father a final kiss on the cheek, after which the businessman handed her over to the doctors and left the hospital as if he had just been run over by a train. A month. Only a month was left for his daughter, because the disease came upon her with terrible force. The doctor said the leukemia outbreak could have been triggered by extreme stress on the eve of the competition. For the first time in his life, Mike regretted giving his daughter to rhythmic gymnastics. From helplessness, the man sank down on the cold stone steps that led to the medical center, and in despair, wrapped his arms around his head. What should he do now? Where to get that damn donor when Alana's entire family had been dead for a long time, and he had never even heard of another relative? At that moment, he saw a woman stop in front of him. Or rather, he didn't even see all of her, just her feet shod in summer-open sandals. A long skirt of light material was building around her legs, and Mike slowly raised his worry-weary face to her. "Who are you?" he asked, looking up at the street fortune teller smiling at him as she strolled leisurely through the city streets at this hour. "I, Hannah," the fortune teller replied solemnly and held out her hand to him. "I see you need help, dear. Let me give you a fortune telling on your hand. Don't be afraid, I won't take any money from you. I see when people are genuinely worried about their troubles, and when they are asking for a fortune telling for fun." The most interesting thing was that this Hannah did not look at all like some gypsy from a traveling Tabor. She was a decently dressed young woman of about 25 or 27, with long blonde hair in a high ponytail and a light blue denim jacket thrown carelessly over her white, aristocratic shoulders. The blue eyes looked at Mike with such genuine sympathy and warmth that he didn't have the heart to turn her away. "I don't think you can help me," the businessman replied tiredly. "I don't think anyone will be able to find the answer to the question that now occupies me more than anything else in the world." The fortune teller's eyebrows rose in amazement. "You don't believe in the power of my gift? Or do you think that because I don't look like a gypsy, I'm of no use to you?" "I have an Irish gypsy grandmother, by the way." Mike looked at the girl curiously. "That's the first I've ever heard of such a thing," he said, and rose slowly to his feet. "Well, Hannah, if you're so sure, then please." The man held out his hand to the fortune teller, and she instantly took it, scrutinizing the tiny lines on his palm and fingers. All the while, Hannah was twirling his hand back and forth. And at the same time, she kept muttering affirmatively, as if she had already figured it all out and was only looking for the latest confirmation of her amazing discovery. "It's clear." Finally, she looked at the rich man with genuine concern. "Do you have someone on your bloodline sick? A very close daughter or sister? I think it's the daughter after all. You want to help her, but you don't know how fate says you need to find another. Then you can save her." Mike, who had been standing there all this time listening to the fortune tellers with undisguised amazement, suddenly frowned sharply. "I mean, how is that finding another? What does it all mean?" Hannah took another quick glance at his palm and nodded affirmatively. "That's right. There can be no doubt. The prophecy says so." Mike pulled his palms from her hands, muttered disappointedly. "What kind of nonsense is this? I mean, I almost fell for it." "Jesus," Hannah, realizing the businessman didn't believe her, only shrugged. "It's up to you. I told you the whole truth as it is. This is the salvation for your daughter. If you let it go to waste, you won't remember me in a bad word because I warned you." With those words, Hannah strode dutifully away toward the park, leaving the anxious and shocked rich man alone with his thoughts. Find another. What on earth could that possibly mean? Meanwhile, the businessman puzzled. Although he did not believe in the predictions of this strange blonde, but his gut felt that there is something useful in this phrase, something that would help him find a way out of his dire situation with Darla. Hannah was on her way home when she witnessed a horrifying scene. Walking across the bridge, the fortune teller saw a young girl of about 17, 18 years old climbing over the railing. The intentions were more than easy to guess. Hannah rushed to her and only by a miracle managed to grab the unfortunate girl by the shoulder, pulling her down with force. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted at the girl when she was already sitting on the pavement, holding on to the railing. "Have you had enough of life or what? What if I am?" The unfortunate girl shouted back at her, and large tears came to her eyes. "If I simply have nothing and nowhere else to live, what do you want me to do and collect alms?" Having breathed a little, the street fortune teller knelt down on her knees beside the girl. Look, I understand you're going through something. Apparently something really bad. Just decided to jump off the bridge into the river. But only the most horrible and unfair thing in the world shouldn't push you to do something so stupid, you know? Life is the most important. God is the most precious thing we have. Can't you just try to walk away from it like that? The young stranger looked at the fortune teller, and her face reflected hopelessness and anguish. Tricked, she tried to explain. So deceived that now I don't know how to go on living or what to do at all. Hannah looked at her doubtfully. What about the boyfriend? No way, the stranger said. She tried to rise to her feet, but she was still a little shaky from the shock she had suffered. My aunt. She robbed near my apartment by fraud and changed the locks. I didn't even have time to get my things before she threw me out of there like a kitten. The girl covered her face with her hands and wept bitterly. She especially felt sorry for the young, stupid one who was ready to give up her life because of some miserable square meters. Then the fortune teller suggested to her, you know what? Let's go to my place now. I'll give you hot tea and we'll eat something at the same time. And you tell me everything in detail, who and how you cheated. I may be able to help you in some way. The girl looked at her with red, tear-stained eyes and nodded gratefully. Thank you. And please forgive me, I didn't mean to scare anyone. It's just the way I am, out of desperation. Don't worry, I'm not vindictive. The fortune teller smirked and extended her hand for an introduction. My name's Hannah. What's yours? Wesley nodded, and the girl replied, what a beautiful name you have. It's something European or Greek, the fortune teller explained. It's just rare now. My grandmother chose it for me. She kept hoping I'd make fewer mistakes in my life than my mother did. The young woman explained to Leslie that the name Hannah translates from ancient Greek as pure, and the fortune teller's mother was characterized by excessive love and mobility, for which she eventually paid the price. Her grandmother said she was sent to the other world by one of the ancient fans, Hannah said, in between, while they put the kettle on and put the flavored shortbread cookies in a saucer. By this time, they had arrived at the fortune teller's small apartment. What a horror. Leslie flung up her hands. How on earth did you survive that? The woman only shrugged and threw her jacket on the old plush couch. I don't know. I was only 5 at the time. That's how my grandmother raised me. She used to take care of me all the time before that, while my mother was getting her own life together. And when all this happened, she took me away from the Tabor and moved here, to the city. We've lived together ever since. She taught me her skills, and I was the best domestic helper for her. It's just a pity she didn't live to see my high school graduation. My grandmother made me such a dress that all my classmates were green with envy the whole evening. Losing a mom is the biggest tragedy in a person's life, Leslie said wistfully. Then she added, I lost mine recently too. Just 4 months ago. I'm sorry. The fortune teller lowered her eyes. What happened? I'm sorry if I'm prying. You promised me you'd tell me what happened to you. Remember? Leslie looked sadly at her new acquaintance. The accident. Mom was coming home from work and crossing the road at a green traffic light. At that moment, some car just oversteered. The police said it had a brake failure or something. Anyway, Mom was gone, hit by a car. Hannah looked at her sympathetically, and then she showed up. That's her sister, my aunt, the girl continued. I was just out of high school and wanted to go to the institute to study history. It all came upon me so suddenly and terribly on my mom's death, not knowing what to do next. Leslie sighed heavily before continuing. She showed up at the funeral for the first time. She was all beautiful and caring. She helped me with the wake. But then when all the guests left and it was like she'd been replaced, cold, calculating bitch, that's what she turned out to be. Yes, you and your aunt have a strained relationship, Hannah said, startled. That's an understatement, Leslie said, angrily, wiping away tears with her fist. I mean, she only wanted her mom's apartment. That's all. She complained to me that I was the only one living in such a huge 2-bedroom, and she had to go to rented apartments. Since she's a sister, she's also entitled to a part of Mom's property. I tried to explain to her that there was no mention of her in the will. However, this woman was just incredibly stuck. The fortune teller listened without interrupting, giving the girl a chance to speak. In the end, Leslie continued, my aunt suggested we split the apartment so that neither of us would be offended. I was a little upset, of course, but then I felt sorry. She and my mom really haven't had a good relationship all their lives. I don't know what caused it, but it must have been something serious. It's unlikely they'd have quarreled over some nonsense. Leslie took a big sip of tea and finished her unfunny story. Anyway, I agreed to the exchange, but she brought in her lawyer, and I couldn't even read what I was signing. It's my own fault, of course. I probably should have insisted that I was given time to familiarize myself with the documents. But in fact, it turned out that there was no exchange. And I signed her, this aunt, a deed of gift for my mom's apartment. For here, the girl again could not contain her feelings and cried literally to tears. What a fool I am. The girl scolded herself. How could I believe her? Well, you didn't know that she would want to do such a mean thing to you. The fortune teller tried to comfort her. It's always the last thing you expect from the people closest to you. But Leslie only shook her head negatively. I should have sensed, should have guessed that since she was acting so strangely and persistently, she was definitely up to something wrong. But I fell for it like a stupid chicken. The girl said that when she returned from the preparatory course for the institute the next day, she could not get to her house. The girl pounded on the door for a long time, until the aunt opened the door and announced that the apartment now belonged to her. And hers she had just cleverly contrived. Can you imagine my feelings? She asked the fortune teller. She told me that she had changed the locks, and now there was nothing in this house that belonged to me. And when I asked her, where do I go now? Knowing what she told me, Hannah looked at the girl curiously. Said I could try to get into the institute the first time and go straight into full-time study, on a budget. Then they say I will be assigned a room in the dormitory and will have a place to live. The young fortune teller was amazed at the cynicism of this horrible woman and patted her shoulder. Okay, don't worry, so we'll think of something. Until then, you can live at my place as long as you want. Girl, you're a good one. I can see you're not lying about your aunt and your situation. Any of us could be in that situation. If you only knew what I sometimes see when I'm walking around the city and reading people's hands or cards. And Hannah shook her head meaningfully. A tiny flicker of hope appeared in Leslie's eyes at that moment. Thank you so much, she thanked the fortune teller fervently. I'll definitely get a job. You'll see. I'll help you clean, I'll help you cook if you want. In response, Hannah advised the girl not to worry and promised her that she would definitely think of a way to teach her aunt a lesson and get Leslie her rightful apartment back. For the next couple of weeks, Leslie lived in Hannah's tiny apartment and helped her around the house. While the young fortune teller earned a living for herself and her entertaining passers-by in the park at the weekend fair, as well as doing personalized card readings and making individual astrological forecasts and horoscopes, for which, as Hannah assured her, she was always paid the most money. Leslie also wasted no time and went all sorts of interviews, all the same. After all this shocking story with her aunt in the apartment, she could not properly prepare for the entrance exams. That's why she decided to try to find some kind of job, not to hang on Hannah's neck, and at the same time to get the experience she needed, without which she was not wanted to be hired by the less decent companies. In the meantime, Mike was trying to hold on with his life. He was constantly looking for a suitable donor for his daughter, but so far everything was to no avail. As before, the businessman visited Darla in the hospital, but each time he became more and more convinced that she had only a little time left. Despite the coordinated, competent actions of doctors, as well as the necessary drugs in such a situation, the girls still needed an urgent operation. Everyone, including Darla, understood this perfectly well and did not give up hope of finding her donor at last. Remembering the fortune teller's strange prediction, Mike could not figure out its basic essence. However, he still listened to the words of Hannah, the bloodline, and hired the best detectives in town to try to track down any of his late wife's distant relatives. You need to calm down, Mike, Vivi said affectionately, walking around him and handing the man a cup of coffee with dark bitter chocolate on a platter, the businessman's favorite treat that helped him relieve a lot of stress. I'm sure sooner or later you'll reach your goal and Darla will recover. At the same time, the secretary looked at her boss with such a languid gaze that he had to look away. And he, of course, still liked this gorgeous woman very much, and she didn't seem to mind trying to take their relationship to the next level. Except that Mike wasn't really interested in that right now. His first priority, as he'd always said, was his daughter. Seeing that she couldn't win the millionaire over, Vivi was only breaking her fingernails under the table, giving him the friendliest smile she could muster. Damn that Darla of his, the woman was tearing and metal in her thoughts. She should have gotten sick right now. When he and I were just starting to have something to stick. Couldn't wait a year for me and her daddy to get married in there. She could have switched her own. No one's stopping me. I'd get his whole fortune if I did. I'd find a way to make good use of my money. He had such devious plans. Vivi continued to work at Mike's company while trying to conquer this impregnable fortress. On a future day, when Mike was scrutinizing the terms of the upcoming deal, his phone suddenly burst with a melodious sound. When the man picked up, it turned out to be one of the detectives he'd sent to track down Alana's relatives calling him. "So, any news?" the businessman asked hopefully. "Yes and no," the detective answered him evasively. "You see, the thing is, it turns out Alana doesn't have any relatives of any kind anymore." Mike's heart immediately dropped somewhere down into the darkest abyss. "Are you sure?" "Maybe you didn't look hard enough." After all, her family was considered quite famous in its day. No second cousin, siblings, or brothers, and a deep sigh was heard at the other end of the phone. "Believe me, Mike, we've pored over every archive in the town and village where your spouse was born, and there's absolutely nothing. However, as I said, we did manage to find something interesting." The businessman immediately concentrated to the best of his ability on the detective's voice. "And what was that?" "When we checked the archives of the hospital where your wife gave birth, we found one interesting detail." The detective began cautiously. "Tell me, Mike, were you aware that Alana had given birth to twins?" "What?" The businessman couldn't believe his ears. "Do you think you're saying that?" "Sam, what twins? My wife never cheated on me and was only pregnant with Darla." It slowly began to dawn on the rich man, and his hunch was confirmed by the detective himself. "That's why I'm asking, because it's about the same single birth," he said slowly. "One of the 2 sample reports I found says that your wife gave birth to 2 twin girls." Mike rubbed his own forehead tensely in his office. He resolutely did not understand what was happening now. "But the doctor didn't tell us anything like that, did he?" "I don't see how that's possible." "Did you have an ultrasound?" the detective asked. "Yes, but can you imagine what it was like back then? The only device in the whole city, and it was malfunctioning every once in a while. Unless there was some mistake and the doctor who performed the ultrasound just didn't see the second child. But that still doesn't change the fact that I never knew anything about the second daughter." "Where is she then?" The detective was silent for a moment, obviously contemplating how best to say the next piece of news. "That's where we come to the most interesting part. There was another woman in labor at the same time as your wife that day, the daughter of the same midwife who delivered Alana's baby. And, according to the documents, the midwife's granddaughter died then, suffocated, entangled in the umbilical cord." Jesus, Mike couldn't take it anymore. "But what does this have to do with me?" "Most directly, I'm afraid, Mike," continued the detective. "As I was saying, the main oddity was that there were originally 2 of each conclusion. That is, both your wife's and the midwife's daughters. And while in Alana's case, and it says she had one of her twins die at birth following the mother, the midwife's daughter's file is quite the opposite." "Actually, they were my little girl," Mike finally realized. "I'm afraid so," Sam replied sadly. "We found both reports in the party section of the head doctor's drawer. Don't ask how we did it. We won't tell you anyway. Fact is, the midwife's daughter never found out anything. She thought she'd given birth to her baby. Soon after, they all moved together, the woman, the daughter, and their grandmother, to live somewhere up north. And that's where their traces are finally lost. So you don't know where my daughter is now?" Mike asked him quietly. "Unfortunately, that's all we've been able to find out," the detective replied. "But still, you now know that there is another daughter of yours somewhere, if you're lucky enough to find her." How am I supposed to find her when I've been counting on you for this?" Mike snapped at the detective. "I don't have any more time. Darla doesn't have any more time. She's dying." It took the businessman a second to pull himself back together and apologize to the detective, thanking him for his work. Mike hung up the phone and slowly sank into his desk chair. Okay, so he had been duped in the most brazen way possible, only giving up 1 infant out of 2. This wife's card was completely fabricated, and it seems that even the midwife herself didn't know that Alana was going to have twins. When it all happened and his wife was gone, the midwife thought it would be no big deal if she gave her daughter one of the twins so that the young woman, God forbid, wouldn't go crazy with grief upon learning of her own baby girl's death. Mike felt absolutely devastated and broken, and his last hope had died before it could take shape. Right now, the businessman knew only one thing. If he lost Darla, he would lose all incentive for further life and work. His daughter was everything to him, and he certainly didn't want to live in a world where she was gone. 3 days later, Hannah brought Leslie a newspaper with free classifieds. "Was grabbed on the way, in case you find something normal here," suggested the fortune teller, seeing how desperately the girl was suffering without a job everywhere she went. During this time, everywhere she was offered to pass first some paid courses or even turned back. citing the lack of yesterday's schoolgirl any experience. Leslie got upset and wanted to try to take a loan from the bank to get at least some training with which she could be hired. When Hannah was able to convince her that all the loans and courses were nothing more than an elaborate hoax paid for by enthusiasts like Leslie herself, it's better to flip through the paper. She persuaded the girl, who had become her best friend in the meantime. Here are always printed vacancies for ordinary people, and maybe something will appeal to you. The girl followed the fortune teller's advice and scrutinized the thin magazine. After an agonizing choice between a dishwasher and a cleaner, Leslie chose the latter, and rightly so. Hannah encouraged her. Of course, it's not the most prestigious profession, but the firm is very good, well known, and they promise a decent salary, so it's a good reason to try for an interview. Leslie agreed with a sigh. This was not the career she had dreamed of, but on the other hand, she had to start somewhere. 25. A 20 man arriving at the address, the girl found a large and bright office of the construction firm, inside which reigned cleanliness and beauty. However, having risen to the 5th floor to go to the director of the company, Leslie froze exactly halted, unable to utter a word. The girl turned as pale as a canvas. Her only wish at that moment was to fall through the ground, but it was too late. Vivi had seen her and was now standing, blocking Leslie's path to the principal's office with her hands at her sides. "You," the secretary whispered. "What are you doing here, you little shit?" Leslie stared at her aunt point blank, never relinquishing her angry but proud gaze. "I'm here to apply for a job. Let me through," she said, and tried to get past Vivi. But she grabbed the girl roughly by the shoulders. "Are you applying for a job as a cleaner? And I'm sitting here wondering how you got here." The secretary's look at that moment was like that of a snake preparing for a fatal leap. "No, my dear, not today," shoved Leslie across the hall to Vivi. "There's nothing for you to do here. I don't want it to be accidentally revealed later that you're the one coming to see me, my dear. That would be a disgrace that would never be cleaned up." Vivi looked at the young girl with all the anger and hatred she could muster. Hearing strange shouting and fumbling outside the door, Mike decided to go out and see for himself what was going on. "Vivi, what's going on?" Whether or not the girl came in for her interview, I've already gotten calls from HR. They say they lost her. Vivi wanted to explain something to him, but saw the supervisor's face gray at the sight of her niece. "Mike, what's wrong with you?" The secretary asked cautiously, and the nasty smile instantly flew off her face. "You're my good girl," the businessman managed to say. The girl looked at him with incomprehensible eyes. She transferred her neighbor's gaze to him and back again. Vivi turned to her niece, and Leslie was ready to swear she saw a hellfire of rage in her eyes. "Get out of here," Vivi ordered her immediately. However, Mike extended his hand toward the girl and shook his head. "No, let her stay. Please, girl. I don't know your name. Give me a few minutes, I beg of you." Leslie didn't know what to do, but there was such desperation written on the man's face that the yesterday's schoolgirl agreed. "Okay," Leslie said simply, and followed Mike. He was in a state of complete shock. After all, in front of him stood an exact copy of his daughter. Could it be true? Was this girl really his lost daughter Darla's twin? If so, he was left with one last chance to save his child. "Please, let's do a DNA test," Mike pleaded with her in his office. "Listen, my daughter is about to die. The doctors have already done everything they can. If it turns out you and my girl are sisters, it could literally save a life." Leslie doubted that such a thing could really happen. But the story the businessman told her about himself and his daughter, and about the results of the investigation, still convinced the girl to try to trust him. After all, if it was true and Darla was her sister, then she would have another family. Having given her consent for the tests to be run, Leslie and Mike immediately drove to the hospital. When the girl's blood was drawn to run all the necessary tests, the man took her to his daughter's room. Darla, of course, was shocked no less than her father. However, she took Leslie's appearance very positively. She greeted the girl in a friendly manner and then told her, "There is no such coincidence in nature. You can see that you and I are alike as 2 drops of water. You must be my lost sister. Daddy told me everything." Leslie felt like she was in some kind of fantasy movie. There was no doubt in the girl's mind that she and Darla were alike, but she'd never felt like she had a sister or even a twin. And after all, twins are supposed to be able to sense such things even from a distance. Congratulations. The test confirmed your parentage 100. The doctor announced to Mike and the girls with a happy smile. "If Leslie is ready, we can begin the process of preparing for surgery." It was all so sudden and rapid for the young girl. Of course, let's get started. It was all she could manage to nod. The preparations went well, and soon Darla was transplanted with some bone marrow and transfused with her own sister's blood. After that, the girl recovered almost immediately, and Leslie, who was lying in the ward with her, still couldn't believe that she had found both a sister and a father at the same time. In the hustle and bustle of events, Leslie did not immediately remember that she wanted to talk to Mike. That evening, when she was feeling better, she asked to spend a few minutes with her father and warned him about Vivi. "Don't believe that woman, please," she said in a voice weak from the surgery. "She is far from being as nice and kind as she wants to appear." In general terms, the girl told her newfound father about the story of her apartment and the fact that she was now staying with Hannah the fortune teller. Hearing about the latter, Mike immediately remembered her find another prophecy. God, that's what that meant. She was talking about Darla's sister. He hadn't realized it right away. Upon learning of his secretary's deception, the businessman was furious at her behavior. The very next day, he fired the bastard and threatened her with jail if she didn't sign the apartment back over to Leslie. Vivi wanted to be rich and wanted to stay free even more, so she gave the apartment back to her niece and left town for good. Finally recovered, Leslie was happy to know that she could now return home. She was going to go to college, just like she wanted to, and promised her father to visit her and Darla whenever she could. The girls had no doubts that they would become friends, so businessman Mike was very happy for them. Hannah Mike invited to his workplace. In gratitude for the fact that she helped his lost daughter, he made the woman his personal astrologer, and the young woman was very happy that her prophecy, having come true, saved the life of an entire family. Gradually, the first timid feelings between her and Hannah were born. Their relationship from a working relationship smoothly turned into a romantic one. As the man, having got to know Hannah better, realized that she could be a new breath of life for him and create for him that missing home comfort, which he so dreamed of. Soon, he and Hannah were married. The wedding was very beautiful and left the guests with many fond memories. Now they all live together in the millionaire's house and enjoy every day, which gives them the opportunity to enjoy life again and get to know each other from new sides.